My friend Wes and I have this tradition of going camping at least once a year. We're both from LA, and over the years we've camped in Arizona, Nevada, and closer spots like Joshua Tree. Every trip's been a blast, leaving us with loads of new memories and shared jokes. So when I suggested a weekend trip from Thursday night to Sunday at Monument Valley, Utah, he was all in and we were pumped. Our very first road trip was to the Grand Canyon. We tried to reach Monument Valley back then, but a snowstorm trapped us. Ever since, I'd wanted to visit. By Thursday night, we were packed up and ready for a 10-hour drive through the desert. Wes took the wheel for the first several hours since I'd stayed up the night before getting things ready and working a long shift. When we reached Barstow, we decided to take a detour. We'd heard about an old ghost town nearby where we thought we could snap some cool nighttime shots. The road to the ghost town was pitch black and super rough. It was around 1 a.m., and I was on edge, watching out the window. You never know what you might run into in the desert at that hour. At one point, I saw a huge 20-foot-tall dark figure in the shape of a person, and it nearly scared me out of my skin. But as we got closer, we saw it was just a massive sign shaped like an old prospector promoting the ghost town. Crisis averted. We also found an abandoned water park not far from there, but decided to steer clear when we noticed some flashlights in the distance. After that, we got back on the road, passing through Vegas around 3:30 a.m. It was eerie how empty and lifeless the city felt in those early hours. I took over driving from there, and the rest of the trip went smoothly. We drove through a place called Colorado City and noticed a lot of empty houses. We were curious and thought about exploring, but we had to keep moving. Later, we learned the town was full of isolated communities with a reputation for being wary of outsiders. Eventually, after a full day of driving and sightseeing, we rolled into Monument Valley around 8 p.m., totally beat. We set up camp and had dinner in the dark since we hadn't eaten much all day. After a few drinks, we took out our cameras for some stargazing photos. Being on Navajo land, I figured I'd push my luck a bit and asked Wes if he'd ever heard of the Navajo legend of the Skinwalker. He hadn't, so I explained it's a kind of Navajo shaman who can change shape to mimic animals or people, sometimes to lure them in. So, how do you know one if you see it? Wes asked. I explained that they look somewhat like animals, but something's always off, like how they move. One clear sign is they have no tail. The Navajo don't even mention skinwalkers, afraid of drawing them close. I then shared a few stories I'd read online about bizarre things people had experienced. One story was about a Navajo guy shooting with his cousins near some ruins. He'd heard odd animal sounds and ended up seeing a tailless black dog baring its teeth. We sat quietly in the freezing night air, listening. A faint breeze came, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. We waited, half expecting something strange, but nothing happened. Probably a camper's dog, I shrugged. I realized I'd left my camera shutter remote in the car, so I told Wes I'd be right back. The car wasn't far, but still a bit out of earshot. While rummaging in the car, I thought I heard my name faintly. I stopped, listened, and heard nothing, figuring I'd imagined it. But just as I found my remote, I heard Wes calling, sounding anxious. I closed the car and hurried back, thinking he'd spotted a snake or something. But when I got back, a black dog was standing there in front of us. We glanced at each other, waiting for one of us to act. Then I noticed and whispered, "Look, it doesn't have a tail." I grabbed a hatchet, ready to defend us, but the dog just acted like any regular dog, wandering around. We both let out a breath of relief. "What happened after I left?" I asked. Wes explained he'd been adjusting his camera when he noticed a dark shape in the shadows. Then he heard a strange licking sound below him, and there was this black dog staring back at him, which is when he called my name. Since the dog seemed harmless, we let it stay with us. It even kept us company the rest of the night, and we decided to call it Skinwalker, as if daring fate. Later, we called it a night and crawled into our tent. the dog curled up in a nearby bush to sleep. Nothing strange happened the next day, though we saw Skinwalker again in the morning, wandering around other campsites with another dog. In the daylight, we noticed his face looked a bit unusual, but he seemed like any other stray. On Sunday morning, something odd happened again, but it might just be a coincidence. We heard coyotes howling in the distance, but other than that, everything was calm. So, I don't know if we had a real Skinwalker encounter, but it was an odd experience we can share with family and friends. My brother Leon and I went camping a couple of summers back. We had always loved nature, though neither of us was especially experienced at it. Living in the city, we'd make it a goal to go on a camping trip once or twice each year. Not in places too secluded, but far enough that there weren't parking lots or public restrooms nearby. This time, we picked a location on public land known for its scenic views. Our plan was to stay there for 4 nights, staying in one place to keep things relaxing rather than adventurous. On a Thursday morning, I picked Leon up from his place. We packed the car with all the supplies he had gathered, then started our drive. We reached the parking spot by around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, then set out on the trail. It was about a 3-hour hike, so we wanted to get moving quickly. Just before dusk, we found our first camp spot. A great clearing with a pre-made fire pit and some big logs around it to use as seating. We set up the tent and got a fire going. The next day, we relaxed around camp, chatting and cooking our food over the fire, then spent the evening talking and looking up at the stars. The second day started out just as well. After breakfast, we noticed we were low on firewood. The area near our campsite was pretty much picked clean. It had been slim pickings when we got there, and now it seemed like there was no wood left at all. Leon offered to go look for more firewood while I stayed back to tidy up. I wasn't worried about him. He was quite competent outdoors and generally cautious. But after some time passed, I began to worry. Leon had been gone for over an hour, which seemed like too long. He hadn't said how long he'd be, but an hour felt excessive. I tried to stay calm, thinking he might have just gone farther out to find better wood. However, when another half hour passed and he still wasn't back, I knew something was wrong. I grabbed our rifle, which we'd brought for wildlife protection, and set off to look for him. I retraced the trail we'd walked the day before, scanning for signs of him. I could tell which way he'd started, but since I'm not much of a tracker, I mostly wandered around hoping to catch some clue. There were footprints here and there, but I couldn't tell if they were ours from when we'd first hiked in. After about 20 minutes, I came across fresh tire tracks, probably from a dirt bike or some sort of four-wheeler. That was strange, since neither of us had one, and we hadn't seen anyone else since arriving. I followed the tire tracks, hoping they might lead me to Leon. After another half hour of walking, I came upon a small clearing where I saw 3 men standing around. Leon was sitting at the base of a tree, clearly hurt. His face was bruised, and he looked out of it. The men hadn't noticed me because I was hiding behind a tree and some bushes. I stayed hidden, trying to figure out what to do. There was no way to get help. My phone had no service out there, and even if we tried to find someone, it would take hours, maybe even a whole day. We were outnumbered, and I didn't know if they were armed. With no better option, I fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare them off. Usually, I wouldn't fire a warning shot, but this situation called for something drastic. The 3 men jumped, looking around, and I yelled something along the lines of, "Get lost," and threatened to shoot again. Moments later, they took off. I waited a minute or two, then rushed over to Leon. "Are you okay?" I asked, helping him to stand. He was shaken but nodded. "Yeah, I think so. They caught me off guard," he said. We knew our best bet was to get out of there as quickly as possible. We returned to the campsite, grabbed a few essentials, some water, a bit of food, our wallets and car keys, then started hiking back to the car. I kept glancing over my shoulder the entire way, afraid they might follow us. When we finally reached the car, it was a massive relief. We drove straight to the nearest ranger station, though no one was there. We found a phone number on one of the signs and immediately called to report what had happened to Leon. I spoke with someone from the ranger's office, but as far as I know, they never tracked down those men. To this day, we can't figure out what those men wanted. We didn't have anything valuable with us, and it's unlikely they thought we did. Our gear might have been worth around $1,000 new, but used it was maybe worth a couple of hundred. We confirmed later that we hadn't accidentally wandered onto private land. The whole area was indeed public, so there was no reason for them to go after Leon like that. I still can't explain it, but I think Leon would have been in real trouble if I hadn't found him when I did. A friend of mine, let's call him Jake, and I used to take camping trips once or twice a year. Back when we were college roommates, we went out more often, but now we're both working full-time, so it's tougher to find the time. Jake was actually the one who got me into camping. He'd been doing it his whole life, while I had never even gone camping until I met him. This story happened around 2 years ago on one of our summer trips. We didn't venture far. We followed a trail, walked a couple of hours, and then set up our tents. The goal was more to enjoy camping than to do any serious hiking, so we usually stayed out for about 4 or 5 days. When we found a good spot, we got everything set up and just relaxed. For the next 3 days, we did the usual, sitting by the campfire, having some drinks and talking. We went on a few short walks and played some board games, but mostly just unwound. That was the whole reason for the trip anyway. On the 4th day, we decided it was time to pack up and head back the next morning. As the sun started to go down, we prepared to light the campfire one last time. Jake said he'd take a short walk to gather some dry wood and asked me to get the food out and ready to cook. I got everything prepared, but as the sky grew darker, Jake still hadn't returned. About 30 minutes had passed. It wasn't that long for a walk, but too long just to collect firewood. I figured maybe he had decided to go for a longer walk than he'd mentioned. Another 30 minutes went by. The sun was completely down, and darkness was setting in fast. I turned on our strong camping lamp, but I knew it wouldn't last long if left on. I started feeling really uneasy about Jake not being back. He was the camping expert between us, so getting lost didn't make sense. I thought it would be smart to start the fire anyway, just in case he was nearby and could see it to find his way back. I grabbed the lamp, gathered some sticks, and used a few matches to get the fire going. After 2 hours, I was starting to panic. I couldn't decide what to do. Should I search for him, head back and try to get help, or just stay put? My mind was racing through different possibilities. What if he was injured and close by? But if he was far away, I'd only risk getting lost myself. 2.5 hours after Jake had left, and 2 hours after night had fully set in, I heard a gunshot in the distance, roughly in the direction Jake had gone. What scared me most was that neither of us had brought a gun. I paced around our campsite, trying to decide what to do, before grabbing the lamp and heading out to look for him. Soon, I heard the sound of someone running toward me. I held up the lamp, my hand shaking, but it only lit a short distance ahead. I saw a figure coming closer. It was Jake. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and face pale. I'd never seen him look that frightened before. In a low, urgent voice, he told me we had to leave immediately. We dashed back to the campsite, grabbed our bags, and left everything else behind. I asked him what had happened, but he wouldn't explain until we were out of the woods. Once we made it out, he told me someone else was there, someone who had confronted him during his walk and held him at gunpoint, making him stay quiet and follow them somewhere. Before they reached wherever that was, Jake managed to escape, and that's when he found me. That's all he's ever told me, no matter how many times I've asked. I know he's purposely leaving out some details, but he just won't share them. One thing he's never mentioned is the gunshot I heard. My guess is that Jake, who's more than capable, may have overpowered the person. Maybe he got hold of the gun and did what he had to in order to get away, which might explain his shock and why the person didn't come after him. Whatever happened out there, Jake hasn't wanted to go camping since, and honestly, I feel the same. I just wish I knew the full truth about that night. I graduated college a couple of years before this happened. My best friend at the time was Ben, always up for an adventure, whether it was a hike or a last-minute road trip. After college, he moved to a mountain town, landing a job with a nature tour company. It wasn't exactly what he studied for, but it was a choice he made. Part of me was a bit envious as I sat in my office in the city. I had planned to visit him for my summer break, and he, being an outdoorsy guy, had organized a camping trip for us. It was just what I needed. He was thrilled to show me around his new area, knowing all the secret spots that wouldn't be on any map. Ben planned a 2-day camping trip to a secluded spot known only by locals and serious hikers. When I arrived at his place, we stayed up talking for a bit, but then went to bed around 10 p.m. so we could start early. We packed up the car with 2 large backpacks, a 3-person tent, a camping stove, cookware, food, water, and some clothes. We planned to sleep right on the ground to save room since it was warm enough to do so. Ben drove while I kept track of the GPS on his phone. The road was a narrow forest path that didn't seem to get much use. Every so often, we had to clear branches or logs to pass. Eventually, Ben stopped at what seemed like a random spot, turned off the car and said, "This is it." I couldn't see any trail, but I followed him. By 3 p.m., we were on our way, with plenty of daylight left. Not much happened the first night. We set up camp as the sun went down and got a fire going. The next morning, we packed up and kept hiking. It was late by the time we found our next spot, but we managed to get another fire going. This time, we stayed up a bit later. Around midnight, with the campfire just embers, Ben and I fell asleep in the tent. At around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to go to the bathroom. I unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to wake him, and walked a bit into the woods. It was pitch dark, and I didn't have a light. The moon's faint glow was barely enough to see. Just as I was finishing up, I noticed a distant light moving like a flashlight bobbing, as if someone were walking with it. I squinted to make sure I wasn't seeing things. Who else would be out there in the middle of the night in such a remote place? Curious and a bit on edge, I decided to watch from behind some trees. The light kept moving, getting closer. Then I heard whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like 2 or more people. They seemed to be heading straight toward our campsite. I thought about waking Ben, but didn't want to make a sound. The whispering grew louder, and the light was close enough to cast shadows over our camp. I could see 2 figures moving cautiously toward our tent. Worried for my friend inside, I acted without thinking. I grabbed a rock and threw it in their direction, and it landed with a dull thud, possibly hitting one of them. The noise must have woken Ben because I heard him stir inside the tent. I called out, "Ben, get the gun." Even though we didn't have one, I just didn't know what else to do. The figures shone their flashlight in my direction, but I was hidden behind the trees. They didn't wait around to check and ran off into the night. I rushed back to the tent, where Ben grabbed his flashlight, and we both scanned the area, but we didn't see anyone. We checked our belongings, and nothing seemed to be missing. Neither of us could sleep, so we kept the fire going and stayed up the rest of the night, talking about what had happened. The next morning, we packed up and hiked back. Once we were back in town, we reported it to the police, but without descriptions or any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I stayed a few more days with Ben, and all we could talk about was that night in the woods. We speculated on who those people might have been and what they were after, but we never got answers. It was just pure luck that I happened to be awake when they came. Whatever they wanted, we wouldn't have been able to stop them. When I was younger, my dad would take me camping at least once a year. My parents had split up before I could remember, and my dad lived in a small mountain town a few hours away. When I was little, we stuck to the easier trails, but as I got older, I wanted to try more adventurous routes. Unfortunately, my dad's health declined around the time I was in high school, so he couldn't join me on overnight hikes anymore. During visits, I started doing shorter hikes on my own, usually just 2 nights, so I'd still have time to visit him afterward. One summer, I chose a trail near my dad's place that we'd often talked about exploring together. I was excited as I prepared, thinking about all the times we'd camped together. It was during my summer break between my sophomore and junior years of college, and I was spending August with him. I just finished a summer job at the start of the month, so I had the rest of the time free to visit family. I borrowed my dad's truck and headed out to the trail alone. When I arrived, there was only one other car in the small parking area. This was one of the more isolated trails around, so it didn't attract many people. I parked a bit down from the other vehicle and began unloading my gear. There wasn't a visitor center, just a dirt lot and a sign marking the trail start. As I approached the path, I noticed the car's back door was slightly open, which caught my eye. Curious, I glanced inside and saw a large camping bag, making me think the person hadn't started their hike yet. I wondered if they were nearby, maybe taking a break. I looked around but saw no one, just the quiet woods and the empty road. I thought about waiting, but then decided it wasn't my business and set off on the trail. After about an hour of hiking, I hadn't seen another person, nor any fresh footprints. Seemed like I was out there alone. By nightfall, I found a good campsite and set up for the night. It was a designated spot, big enough for several tents, but I was the only one there. As the sun set, I cooked a simple dinner and sat by my small fire. With nothing much else to do, I went to bed not long after dusk, lying awake for a couple of hours, just listening to the forest sounds. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine, which was odd since the trail didn't allow vehicle access. When I peeked outside my tent, I saw what looked like a park ranger coming my way. I got up to meet him. "Good morning," he said. "Sorry to bother you, but we've got a situation. There's a missing person in the area, and we're evacuating the trail to investigate." His words took a moment to sink in, and my mind went straight to the car I'd seen at the trailhead with the camping bag inside. When he asked if I'd seen anything unusual, I mentioned the car but hadn't noticed anything else. He nodded and made a note in his book. "We're asking everyone to pack up and head back so we can keep the area clear for search teams," he added. I returned to my tent, quickly gathered my things, and started back down the trail. I felt a bit nervous, wondering if there might be some danger out there. But after about an hour, I saw 2 more rangers on ATVs, which reassured me. I figured if anyone was lurking around, they'd be avoiding the rangers. When I got back to the trailhead, there were more vehicles there, police officers, additional rangers, and some search equipment. The car I'd noticed earlier was now blocked off by a police barricade. I briefly spoke with one of the officers, explaining that I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. I left feeling uneasy, wishing there was something more I could do to help. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on the news, hoping for good news. But the missing person was never found, and it became a big mystery in the community. People speculated about what could have happened, but no one had any answers. From what I've heard, authorities suspected foul play. I doubt anything or anyone dangerous was lurking out there while I was hiking, but I guess it's possible. Since then, I've continued hiking but never go alone anymore. Luckily, my dad's health has improved, and we can camp together again, although we stick to spots accessible by car now, which I'm more than okay with. This unsettling experience happened to me and a group of my friends a few summers ago. It was me, Mike, Jay, and Charlie. Jay and Mike had also brought their girlfriends along, so there were 6 of us all together. Our destination was a secluded area in a state forest not far from where we lived. The site was part of a campground surrounded by thick woods. I had visited before and barely saw another person during my previous trip. We took 2 cars and parked near the visitor center before setting off on foot. Each of us carried a big backpack with personal items and some food. The trail took us through tall trees and winding streams, creating a beautiful view. I hadn't left town for a while, so I was excited to finally get outdoors again. I almost forgot how much I enjoyed being in nature. After about 2 hours of hiking, we found the ideal campsite. A quiet, open spot surrounded by dense trees. The trees around the area created a natural barrier, making it tough to go far without getting tangled up in branches. It was the same spot I had camped at last time, probably the first decent site along the trail, and it suited us just fine. We set up our tents even though it was only around 2 p.m., with plenty of daylight left. Once we were settled, we explored the area. I knew of a lake nearby, so we went for a swim and enjoyed a few drinks. The day was fantastic. As the sun started to set, we returned to our campsite and started a fire. Jay had brought dinner for the first night, just hot dogs, which was typical of him, not putting in much effort. We roasted the hot dogs over the fire and swapped stories. Before long, it was around 1 a.m. I was the first to head to bed, but the others followed shortly after. I had my own tent, a small 2-person tent. The couples shared one tent, and Charlie had his own as well. In the stillness of the night, I heard faint sounds coming from the trees. It sounded like someone walking, but didn't seem like an animal. It had to be a person. I wasn't too worried, thinking it was probably one of my friends heading out to use the bathroom. Just as I was about to drift off, I was jolted by a scream. At first, I thought it was one of the girls, but after listening more closely, I realized it was Jay. I unzipped my tent and peeked out into the darkness. What I saw next stopped me in my tracks. A dark figure stood by Jay's tent. I knew it wasn't one of my friends since the shape didn't match any of them. This figure was tall, easily over 6 feet, with long hair and a trench coat. I couldn't make out much else in the shadows. I called out, hoping to scare off whoever it was and protect my friends. But when the figure turned toward me, I could only see a tall shadow, blanketed in darkness. I did catch a glimpse of something that looked like a knife in his right hand. Before I could react, a loud bang echoed through the night. Charlie, always quick on his feet, had fired his gun into the air. In the confusion, the figure melted back into the trees and disappeared. We all sat there, stunned and looking at each other in confusion. There was no way any of us were going back to sleep after that. I rekindled the fire, and we huddled around it, discussing what had happened. I thought it was just a man, but Jay insisted it was some kind of creature. Charlie suggested it might have been a werewolf or something, but I'd seen it the clearest, and I was sure they were letting their imaginations run wild. When morning came, I noticed a huge cut in Jay's tent, a big gash that I hadn't spotted in the dark. The figure had slashed it open. We quickly packed up and hiked back to the main road. We reported the incident to a park ranger, who mentioned that other campers had reported strange encounters in the same area. I gave him a sarcastic thanks for the warning, though he deserved worse. When I was around 12, I went to a summer camp a few hours from my town. It was my first time there, but one of my closest friends, Tom, had been going every summer. A few other boys from school also went, but Tom was the only one I really knew well. When we arrived, Tom told me about an old cabin hidden in the woods nearby. He said it was deserted and we should check it out. It sounded exciting and a bit creepy, but we decided to go for it. Tom mentioned that he and some other guys had explored it the previous summer, but they got too scared and left before seeing everything. This time, Tom wanted to go all the way in. We planned to go one night after everyone at camp had fallen asleep. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, put on our sneakers, and waited for the right moment. Once everything was silent, we slipped out of our bunks and headed into the woods. Walking through the forest at night felt eerie. It was dark except for our flashlights, and every sound seemed louder. We kept walking, searching for the cabin, but it was harder to find than we expected. Tom led the way since he had been there before, but it seemed like he had forgotten exactly where it was. Finally, after what seemed like forever, we spotted it. The cabin looked old and abandoned, as if no one had been there for years. It was exciting to finally find it, but also spooky. We circled the outside first. It was a weathered log cabin, like something from an old story. The place was falling apart. There was no glass in the windows, the wood was decayed, and some parts of the metal roof were missing. The front door was also gone. We went inside to explore. The place was dusty and filthy, and it felt like a big adventure to us as kids. There were a few rooms even though it was small. We were standing in the living room but could see a kitchen in the back and a door that likely led to a bedroom. After a few minutes of checking out the living room and kitchen, we heard a noise that seemed to come from the bedroom. We froze and listened. It sounded like a floor creaking, but neither of us had moved. I was scared and wanted to leave, but Tom wanted to investigate. Not wanting to look like a wimp, I pushed down my fear. We slowly approached the door. Tom reached for the knob and started to open it. Just as he had it open about a third of the way, an arm shot out and slammed the door shut from inside. Someone was in there. We both freaked out. We didn't know who it was or what he was doing there. Without a second thought, we turned and sprinted back to camp as fast as we could. We didn't stop or look back until we were safely back in our bunks. We decided not to tell anyone, worried we'd get in trouble for sneaking out. Looking back, I'm not sure if we were really in danger. It seemed like whoever was inside just wanted to be left alone. Still, it's unsettling to think that someone, maybe a homeless person, had taken up residence in an old cabin near a popular summer camp. I walked by the cabin again during the day but didn't go in. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw a shadow pass across the front window. It was just a faint figure, but I was certain I saw it. We never did find out who was inside. When I was around 10, my family and I went camping together. We drove to a state park that was a few hours away from home. It wasn't a very remote place. Probably wouldn't have been easy to do serious camping with young kids anyway. Really, it was more like a vacation just with tents. Our campsite was even accessible by car, so that gives you an idea of the setup. We left early in the morning, my mom, my brother, and my sister. My brother was a year older than me, and my sister was a couple of years younger. The three of them shared a large tent, and I had one of my own. When we arrived, I noticed a group of guys at the site next to ours. They looked like they were around college age, maybe in their early 20s, and there were 4 of them. I remember them being loud, annoying, and not very considerate of the quiet atmosphere of the campground. Once we set up our tents, we went for a walk around the area. When we got back, the guys were sitting around, drinking and talking loudly. They were swearing a lot. Not that it bothered me, but my mom didn't appreciate it. As the evening wore on, they seemed to be getting angry with each other. I couldn't figure out what was going on, and honestly, I didn't care much. It was hard to sleep, but eventually, I managed to get a few hours of rest. The next morning, when we woke up, the men were passed out. One of them was sprawled out near the fire pit, and another had his boots sticking out of a tent. They were a total mess. My mom warned me to keep my distance. She had a feeling something was off with them. I followed her advice, though I was a bit curious. Then, I noticed something that made me uneasy. There was a large hunting knife stuck in the wooden picnic table at their site. There didn't seem to be any good reason to have a knife like that out, but I didn't worry too much. I even thought it looked kind of cool. My mom, on the other hand, was clearly worried. When the second night came, their behavior only got worse. They were shouting louder, and I could hear anger and tension in their voices. It seemed like there was some bad blood between at least a couple of them. The atmosphere was uncomfortable, to say the least. Out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. I froze, trying to process what had just happened. I could feel it in my chest, an intense, startling feeling. At first, I thought it might have been firecrackers, but when the park ranger arrived, I realized it was a gunshot. The ranger went over to their campsite and had a serious talk with the man who seemed to be the one responsible. Their voices were firm, and it soon became clear that one of them had fired a weapon, putting everyone nearby at risk. My mom told me to stay where I was. I wanted to join them in the main tent, but she insisted I stay put. We listened as more officers arrived, and I could see their flashing lights through the fabric of my tent. The guys sounded drunk, though they cooperated with the police. Eventually, they were led away. The next morning, their site was completely cleared out. A little while later, the ranger came by and told us we had to leave as well. We didn't argue and packed up quickly. Despite the bad experience, we returned to the same campground several times in the years after that. Nothing like this ever happened again. I never found out what became of those guys. I'm pretty sure the one who fired the gun faced consequences. Luckily, no one got hurt, but it was definitely against the rules to even have a gun there, especially since they were drinking. This took place last year. I went hiking with my younger brother, Mike. It was a warm weekend in early fall, late September. The place we picked was crowded during summer, but it quieted down a lot as autumn set in. I'd been there before, but Mike hadn't. He didn't have much outdoor experience, while I'd gone on a good number of challenging trips. We packed up our camping stuff, loaded the truck, and headed out. There was a parking lot and a small ranger post with a gift shop at the entrance. A few other cars were parked, so we thought there might be other hikers around. There weren't any assigned campsites. You just hiked in and set up camp wherever you found an open spot. If a space was empty, it was fair game. We set off early in the afternoon and hiked for about 4 hours. Our first spot was right by a lake, with plenty of space for our tent and a fire pit already set up. We looked around for firewood, but the area was pretty picked over. We only managed to gather a few small sticks, not enough for a decent fire. We figured we'd find more wood as we went farther. We went to bed early that night, but I lay awake for a while. We were sleeping directly on the ground to keep our packs lighter, which wasn't very comfortable. During the night, I heard some noises. Most of them were from deer, but I also heard an animal sound that I was pretty sure came from a bear. It was easy to tell the difference. I knew there were bears in the area, so we had taken the right steps. Our food was hung high in a tree, so I wasn't too worried. There was nothing in the tent to attract wildlife. The next morning, we packed up early and hit the trail again. Around noon, Mike noticed something strange. A backpack left on the ground just a bit off the trail, maybe 20 feet away. It was bright blue, so it was easy to spot against the grass. We cautiously walked closer to take a look. When I examined it, my heart skipped a beat. The backpack had deep claw marks on it, clearly left by a bear. We knew the risks of hiking here, but seeing this was a reminder of the real danger. We were afraid there had been a bear attack. I crouched down to look closer at the bag, hoping to find something with the owner's info so the rescue team would know who to look for. Then, I noticed there was blood on the bag, and it was still fresh. That was enough for us. We backed away and turned around. Our trip was over. There was someone hurt out there, and a bear that might be more dangerous than usual. Mike was more shaken than I was, but I was scared, too. We hiked out as fast as we could. It had taken us about 6 or 7 hours to get in, and it took us less than 5 to get out. The sun was setting as we reached the ranger station, and we quickly reported what we found. Search teams were sent out that night, but they didn't find anything. A few days later, we heard news that another hiker who had been on the same trail had gone missing. The signs pointed to a terrible possibility that the bear might have crossed paths with this unfortunate person. For the next several days, searchers combed through the forest, looking everywhere for any sign of the missing hiker. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, hope began to fade. The hiker was never found. This was big news in our area because animal attacks like this are extremely rare. I haven't heard of another incident like it since. I still enjoy the outdoors, but after this, Mike said he'd never come along with me again. He took it hard, and I understand why. I go on a lot of quick camping trips throughout the year. I try to keep them under 3 days so I can go over a weekend and only miss a day or two of work. This was just another trip I had planned to take one weekend in mid-April. My idea was to hike about 5 hours to reach a small lake, set up my camp next to it, stay a couple of nights, and then head back. On the morning of the trip, I drove out and started my hike at around 8 a.m. There weren't any trails leading to this lake, which is one reason I picked it as my spot. Since it was only about a 5-hour hike, I wasn't too worried about losing my way, and I'd also avoid crowds of other campers. About 4 hours in, I thought I caught sight of someone. I was spacing out when I noticed something moving quickly in the distance. I froze, looking around to see who or what it was, but nothing else moved. Since I hadn't been staring right at it when it happened, I couldn't be certain I'd seen a person, but I was a bit more alert for the last hour of my hike. When I reached the lake, I was blown away by how beautiful it was. A perfect spot to rest. I didn't take long to pick a place to set up my camp, finding a spot tucked among the trees by the lake's edge. Almost as soon as I got settled, though, I noticed someone across the lake, walking by the trees. They didn't have any gear, just walking aimlessly. I looked around to see if they had a camp nearby, but there was nothing. After a minute, they stepped into the woods and disappeared. This left me feeling a bit on edge, realizing someone else was out there by this remote lake. It made me wonder if I really had seen someone while I was hiking. I decided to stay at my campsite for the rest of the evening. When night came, I started a small fire, trying to keep it low-key so it wouldn't draw attention. It had been nearly 4 hours since I'd seen the person, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. I warmed up some food, ate, and took out a book to pass time, but I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks because of what happened earlier, but after a few minutes, I couldn't focus on reading. I put the book down, packed up my things, and got ready for bed. Before putting out the fire, I did one last scan around me. About 15 yards away, I saw someone standing. It was dark, but I could tell they were watching me. They stood perfectly still, just staring, and I stared back. We stayed like that for a whole minute until they began to back up, still facing me, moving into the trees until they disappeared into the dark. I was shaking with fear. What were they doing out here, and would they come back? I made my fire bigger and stayed up the entire night. When dawn finally came, I packed up quickly and left, not wanting to stay even a second longer. As I hiked back, I swear I heard faint footsteps behind me a few times. Even now, when I think about it, I feel that same fear. I don't know who that person was, why they were there, or what they wanted. But based on how they seemed to be following me, I don't think their intentions were good. I'm almost certain that if I'd stayed another night or gone to sleep, I might not have made it back. I looked out at the winding logging path, my thoughts filling with memories from when I was younger. My dad would take my sister and me deep into the woods, camping far off the usual routes, where the only sounds were the trees swaying and wildlife roaming freely. I remember hiking through these woods, exploring streams and waterfalls, and falling asleep under the stars. Now, I was bringing my own son out here, hoping to create similar memories. As we turned onto the trail, the trees seemed to close in, casting long, dark shadows. The air smelled thick with pine and damp earth. My son, Andrew, was excited for his first off-the-beaten-path camping trip. He was 13 years old, just about to start high school after summer. As we ventured deeper into the woods, a strange feeling of discomfort crept in. The trail was familiar but had changed. We rounded a bend, and then I saw it. A large cell phone tower, towering above the treetops like a skeleton. I felt a shock, almost a sense of violation. This was the place where I had spent so many childhood summers. I glanced at Andrew, who was staring up at the tower with wide eyes. "Look, Dad," he said. I forced a smile, trying to hide my discomfort. "Yeah, buddy, that's something," I replied. We kept going, passing a few RVs and campers, but I couldn't shake my irritation. The tower stood there like an intruder, spoiling the peacefulness of the woods. I decided we needed to get away from it, find a spot far enough to enjoy nature as it was meant to be. The trail became rougher, the trees tighter together, and the shadows darker. Andrew had stopped talking, sensing my unease. I tried to reassure him with a smile, but my mind was full of questions. Who had put that tower here and why? What kind of people would camp near something so unnatural? I was suddenly angry, not just at the tower, but at the fact that it seemed to overwrite the memories I had of coming here with my dad and grandfather. Felt like it took something away from me. I gripped the wheel tighter and pushed deeper into the forest, determined to find a spot where the wilderness still felt real. As we bumped along, the air grew heavy, almost oppressive, and the trees closed in around us. But I wasn't giving up. We needed to find somewhere untouched, where the memories we were about to make wouldn't be tainted by that tower. Finally, we came to a meadow tucked into a valley, the sun bathing the area in warm light. I looked over at Andrew, who was filled with excitement. This was it, the perfect spot for camp. I parked the truck and helped him gather firewood. The silence was nearly complete, only interrupted by the sound of birds and rustling leaves as we set up the tent. It was exactly what boondocking was all about. Getting away from everything, reconnecting with nature, and sharing it with the next generation. Once the camp was set, we went for a short hike to explore. The dry creek bed nearby offered a path that led us through the hills, and before long, we came upon a peaceful lake. The water sparkled in the fading light, and I felt a rush of recognition. "Andrew, I remember this lake," I said softly. "I came here with your grandfather a long time ago." His eyes lit up. "Is there fish in there, Dad?" I smiled. "Lots of trout, buddy. This place is a hidden gem." As we looked around, something felt strange. There were no other fishermen, and the lake seemed untouched. Andrew asked if he could fish, and I agreed, but told him we'd do it tomorrow. He nodded happily, his excitement showing as we returned to camp. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the meadow. We spent the evening talking, watching the stars, and listening to the fire crackling. Andrew talked about his school year, his eyes wide with enthusiasm, and I listened, my heart full of pride and nostalgia. When night fell, I felt that familiar sense of vulnerability you get when camping in the wilderness. The darkness, the quiet, the feeling of being exposed. It was all part of the experience. We said goodnight and went to bed, the sounds of crickets and an occasional owl lulling me to sleep. I had some of the best rest I'd had in years. The next morning, I woke to the glow of sunlight creeping over the hills. I stoked the fire, adding fresh kindling to get the flames going. Andrew came out of the tent, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. We made breakfast together, the smell of bacon and coffee filling the air, making my stomach growl. After eating, we set up an archery range, with targets pinned to a tree about 30 yards away. We took turns shooting arrows, the sound of them thudding into the target satisfying. It was a new activity for us, something I'd never done with my father. Felt good, creating new traditions with Andrew. Next, we decided to hike up the highest hill in the area. The climb was tough, but the view from the top was worth it. We sat on a rocky ledge, looking out over the rolling hills and woods below, the wind carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was high and I was exhausted. Andrew, however, was still full of energy. "Hey, Dad, can we go fishing now?" he asked eagerly. I smiled and nodded. "Sure thing. Just be careful and don't go too far." I helped him get his gear ready, and he set off toward the lake, fishing rod in hand. Watching him go, I couldn't help but feel proud. He was growing up, becoming more independent every day. It reminded me of when I was his age, exploring on my own, becoming a man. Once he was out of sight, I crawled into the tent, my body heavy with fatigue. As I lay there, trying to rest, I began to feel a strange unease. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the silence almost oppressive. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just exhaustion. But deep down, I knew something was off. Then something woke me up. It was a loud, shrill sound, so sudden and jarring. I snapped awake, disoriented, unsure of where I was or what time it was. The stillness outside told me it was nearly dark. I unzipped the tent and found Andrew was gone. Panic surged through me, but I tried to calm myself. He was capable with a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a pocket knife. He'd be okay for a little while. I began to prepare the camp, splitting kindling, getting the fire going, and starting dinner. As time passed, the forest grew darker, and I became more anxious. I looked toward the lake and heard that same shrill sound again, this time from higher up the hill. It sounded like a woman screaming, but then I realized what it was. A mountain lion. The shriek was so sharp, it froze me in place. I immediately thought of Andrew. He could easily mistake the sound for someone in distress, which could lead him into danger. I grabbed my flashlight and pistol and started jogging toward the lake, hearing the mountain lion's cries growing louder. As I reached the water's edge, I saw Andrew on the far side, preparing to head into the woods. The sound had lured him across the lake, coaxing him toward the darkness, towards whatever trap the animal had set. I screamed his name just in time to stop him. "Andrew, stop! Come back over here!" I yelled. He turned and made his way back, slowly and carefully, hopping over rocks and shoreline. Took him about 20 minutes, but he finally made it safely back. "Andrew, what were you doing?" I asked, relief flooding through me. He explained that he thought the sounds were from a woman in trouble. I explained the danger, and we spent the night listening to coyotes, owls, and sometimes the mountain lion's cries, until we both drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the area was crawling with law enforcement, forest rangers, and game wardens. There had been a mountain lion attack nearby, and a man had been injured with his dog killed. We were lucky to have avoided danger. Deciding not to risk another night, we packed up camp and headed back down the mountain, still in awe of how close we had come to disaster. During long weekends and the right seasons, my favorite activity is through hiking. Some call it backpacking, but I prefer to think of it as conquering established trails. Trails like the Green Mountains Trail or the New Mexico Trail, which can take months to complete. However, for me, these are just daydreams. My hikes are usually between 20 to 40 miles and take only 2 to 4 days. I prefer hiking alone, deep in the wilderness, far from civilization. I camp wherever the trail leads me and continue where I left off in the morning. This story is about a hike I did in a familiar area, one of my favorite spots for a quick trip. It is beautiful, rugged, and the crowds mostly stick to the main trails, so it's easy to escape them. I drove to the trailhead, parked my truck, and spent some time making sure I had everything packed. There's nothing worse than getting far out on the trail, only to realize you've forgotten something important like matches or a book. Once everything was in place, I slung my pack over my shoulders and set off with excitement. I'd be done with this section in 2 days, as I'd done it many times before. There's something special about this stretch of trail. Maybe it's the promise of solitude or the challenge of the terrain. Whatever it is, I was eager to hit it. The first few hours passed in a blur of sweat as I moved through the trees, with the sun warming me and casting dappled shadows on the ground. I passed a few hikers, and we exchanged pleasantries as we crossed paths. But as the day went on, the crowd thinned out, and I was alone. The trees grew closer, the canopy above dense and green. I followed the sound of a stream to a beautiful clearing where a few fishermen stood casting their lines. I watched for a moment, mesmerized by the ripples on the water. As I continued, the trail took me higher, and the air grew cooler. The trees became sparser, and the weight of my pack dug into my shoulders, but I pressed on. After hours of climbing, I reached a ridge and found a stunning clearing, bathed in golden sunlight. I dropped my pack, relieved to be free of its weight for a moment, and took in the view. The clearing was like a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering trees and a ring of boulders. A small stream ran through the middle, its source and destination a mystery to me. I explored the area, my boots quiet on the soft earth. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers, and I felt at peace. This was why I did these hikes. Nature had a way of soothing the body, mind, and spirit. My first task was to clear away some poison ivy. I always carry a knife, but I also have a machete strapped to my pack for tougher angles. I used it to clear the ivy and ensure I wouldn't suffer any rashes. As I made my way back to my pack, I noticed something strange. A piece of fabric caught in a bush. I approached it, curiosity piqued. It was a torn and frayed piece of cloth, old and weathered. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just left behind by a previous hiker. But as I set up camp, an odd feeling crept over me, as though I were being watched. I looked around but saw nothing unusual, just trees, rocks, and the quiet of the wilderness. I gathered firewood, set up my tent, and even tried my hand at fishing. Later, as the sky darkened, I settled by the fire to cook my dinner, but that unsettling feeling didn't leave. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered, like I wasn't truly alone. As night fell, I tried to relax after a long day of hiking, but the darkness deepened and I began to hear a strange noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it grew louder and more persistent. It sounded almost like someone in distress. I tried to ignore it, but it became harder to do so. The noise was odd, like a flapping sound, and I couldn't tell if it was an injured person or animal. Something felt wrong, so I grabbed my flashlight and set off to investigate. As I moved through the trees, I found more signs of recent human activity. Discarded gear, pieces of fabric, and a fire pit. My mind raced with possibilities. Could someone be hurt? Lost? Or was it something darker, like a body being disposed of? I pushed through a thicket of trees, flashlight casting strange shadows, and then I heard voices. Panicked, urgent voices that I rounded a boulder and suddenly found myself face to face with a young couple. Naked and caught in an intimate moment. I almost stepped on them. I could literally smell them in the air, which was strange and uncomfortable. For a moment, we froze. We all realized I was the intruder. I apologized, backing away, but they didn't react well. They both went into a panic but made no attempt to cover themselves. Sorry, "I thought someone needed help," I said. But the man shouted, "You're a pervert. How'd you find us out here?" The woman pressed, "You like sneaking up on people?" They came at me, hurling insults and rocks. I had no choice but to retreat. I moved as fast as I could, grateful for my boots and the lack of a heavy pack. But these two were relentless. They threw rocks at me as they chased me through the woods. I knew I had to keep my distance. If they were willing to throw rocks, who knew what else they might do? My heart pounded as I ran, the flashlight casting frantic shadows around me. The couple was closing in, their rage palpable. I had to keep running. I could feel their anger as they gained on me, their footsteps growing louder. I knew something was off. Any normal person would have been embarrassed by the intrusion. It made me wonder if something darker was happening. Was the woman underage? Kidnapped? It didn't make sense. Why would they come all this way just for that? I continued to stumble through the forest, my flashlight a liability that gave away my position. I darted around a massive tree and turned off the light, holding my breath. The silence around me was deafening, broken only by my ragged breathing. The couple's footsteps were still close. I pressed myself against a tree, trying to stay still. Eventually, their voices faded as they moved off toward my camp. I stayed hidden, my heart still racing, waiting for the moment when I could escape. I couldn't stay in the clearing much longer. I had to get out. I grabbed my gear as quietly as possible, packed up, and began to head for the hillside, trying to put as much distance between me and the couple as I could. I reached a small crevice in the rocks and hid there, hoping they wouldn't find me. Their shouting and insults grew fainter, but I knew they were still out there, still looking for me. As the night wore on, I figured they might not give up. I kept my breath steady and waited. Finally, their voices faded completely. The morning brought silence, and I began to wonder if it had all been a hallucination. But no, I knew what had happened. I trudged down the hillside, past a few more fishermen who waved as I walked by. I waved back, glad to be leaving. I never saw that couple again, and that was the only time I didn't finish a hike. It was just too strange. Afterward, I kept an eye on the news for any reports of strange happenings in the area, but saw nothing. I took a few months off from hiking, planning my next trip to a more remote location. Thankfully, nothing like that ever happened again. I should start by warning you that my story involves food poisoning, so it's best to avoid reading this while eating. A few years ago, I packed up my bike with camping gear and spent the next 7 months cycling 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers, across much of the United States. Most of the time, I chose to camp in the wild, finding remote spots in the woods where I could be alone, unnoticed, and without anyone caring. I traveled this whole journey alone. It was mid-November in southern Washington, and the day had been pretty uneventful as I biked along. But in the afternoon, I started feeling a bit of stomach discomfort. It wasn't severe enough to stop me from riding, but it was certainly noticeable. Regardless, I decided to camp out that night, and as dusk approached, I easily found a spot to set up camp. After pitching my tent, I went through my usual routine, writing in my journal and brushing my teeth before going to bed just as night fell. Riding with 80 pounds, 36 kilograms of gear every day makes a person hungry, and I typically ate around 4,000 calories a day but still lost a bit of weight. So on this particular night, I was surprised by how little appetite I had as I went through my evening routine. Once I turned off the light and lay down, my stomach discomfort worsened. I started feeling nauseous and would sit up, ready to unzip the tent and throw up, but after sitting still for a while, the nausea would ease, so I'd lie back down. A few minutes later, the sick feeling returned. Eventually, around 11:30, I threw up. I rinsed my mouth with some water, drank a little more to rehydrate, and lay back down. I felt much better and managed to get some sleep, but only for 2 hours. At 1:30 a.m., I woke up feeling nauseous again. I went through the same cycle, sitting up, feeling like I might throw up, the nausea fading, then returning. Around 2:30, I threw up again. I rinsed my mouth, drank more water, and went back to bed. At 4:30, I woke up once more. Thankfully, I didn't vomit for a third time, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep again before sunrise. So, as I waited for the first light of morning, I started making plans. I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to reach civilization before my condition worsened, especially since I had run out of water overnight. Fortunately, there was a town about 30 miles, 50 kilometers, away, which was usually an easy ride for me, and it had a reasonably priced motel. So I decided that, as soon as it got light, I would bike to the town, get a room, and take the chance to rest up. As soon as daylight broke, I heard the soft sound of rain hitting my tent. I checked my phone, and the forecast said it wouldn't last long. Sure enough, the rain stopped after 20 minutes. I moved quickly to pack up, putting my gear outside, taking down the tent, and loading everything onto the bike. But as I moved the bike toward the road, something didn't feel right. When I checked, I found I had a flat tire. Just my luck, but I had the tools, parts, and skills to fix it, so I got to work. In my not-so-great mental state, fixing the flat took longer than it should have, and by the time I had the bike ready to go, the rain had returned. With little choice, I put on my jacket, switched on my bike lights, and started riding. It wasn't even 8 a.m., and already it felt like the worst day of my trip out of the 100 or so days I had spent on the road. I was miserable. Every pedal stroke felt like a monumental effort. I was cold, wet, and exhausted, physically sore and mentally drained. I was hungry but couldn't stomach much food, and I had no water. I couldn't recall feeling more hopeless during the entire trip or even back home. Finally, I reached the town. After picking up some easy-to-digest food at the store, I went to the motel. I arrived an hour or two before check-in, but I must have looked as bad as I felt, so the receptionist let me into a room early. After a long shower and a call home to my mom, I passed out and slept for 13 hours straight. The next morning, I woke up feeling much better. It was 60 miles, 100 kilometers, to a larger city I had been looking forward to visiting, and even though it was a long day for me, I felt good enough to make it there by evening. The following day, however, the food poisoning hit me again while I was visiting a museum, so I spent the next day resting in the hostel. That cleared everything out of my system, and by the next day, I was back to full strength. Looking back, I'm just grateful the worst of it happened while I was in town and not out in the middle of nowhere. Every year when I was a kid, my family would go on big camping trips. I was always excited because we lived in a quiet part of Arizona where there wasn't much to do, and we'd travel to Washington where there were lush forests. Seeing trees and green fields was my favorite part, but I also loved catching up with my cousins. Even though we didn't see each other often, we were close. My cousin Luis, who was a year older than me, was more like a brother. We were inseparable whenever we were together. After one particular trip, we grew even closer because of something that happened. It took us both some time to fully understand what had occurred and what could have happened to us. The story starts on the second day of our camping trip. Most of the family was either at the lake or sitting around the campfire. Since Luis didn't like swimming, we decided to explore the woods instead. We played a version of tag called Bandit, taking turns as the cop, trying to catch the bandit. We'd run around for hours, but in the woods, it's easy to get lost. We tried to stay within sight of each other, but when Luis started chasing me with a big stick, I guess my adrenaline kicked in, and I ran faster than I ever had before. I'm not sure how long I ran, but eventually, I ended up near an old, rundown trailer. Luis wasn't too far behind, but I remember him dropping the stick and focusing on the trailer, which we assumed was abandoned. We talked about checking it out, but for some reason we didn't. We started walking back, unsure of the direction, when about 10 minutes later, we saw a couple coming toward us, pushing a shopping cart full of stuff. The woman came over and was really kind, while the man hung back. She asked if we were lost, where we were from, and how old we were. I remember when we told her our ages, she looked back at the guy and then back at us. She assured us we didn't have to be afraid, offering to help us find our way back to our campsite after they dropped off their things. She also mentioned we could have s'mores if we wanted. Luis and I were a little unsure, but she seemed nice, and it was still daylight, which made everything feel less suspicious. My 7-year-old self thought bad people only acted at night, so I felt safe. We walked with them, following their trail back to their camp. As she chatted with Luis, I glanced at the shopping cart. It was filled with rusty metal objects, and everything looked like junk. Nothing was packed or organized, just random trash. I began to feel uncomfortable, and I could tell Luis was too. Every time I looked at the man, he wasn't smiling. At times, he'd just stare at me with a blank expression. Even after all these years, I still remember how unsettling he looked. We walked a bit further until the trailer appeared again. The woman grabbed our hands and asked if we were excited for s'mores. Suddenly, I heard Luis's name called, and then mine. We all stopped. The lady squeezed my hand tighter and asked the man something along the lines of what they should do. He replied, but I can't remember his words. The lady then started turning us toward the trailer, holding our hands even tighter and picking up the pace. I looked back and saw my sister through the trees. Without thinking, I yelled her name, and instantly, the woman let go of my hand. Luis and I ran to her as she came toward us. My sister shouted that she had found us, and our parents came running. The couple told my parents a strange story about how they had been looking for us for a while, saying how sweet we were. My mom and dad invited them over for burgers, but they politely declined. I remember my dad and uncle talking about how creepy the man had been. Luis and I eventually told my sister that the couple was strange, but she didn't understand. It wasn't until years later that we both realized the couple probably didn't have good intentions. We came to the conclusion that they were probably struggling financially and may have been planning to sell us or something worse. For years, I kept this from my parents because I felt like I needed to be the strong one in the family. Thinking about that time always made me feel uneasy, like we were targeted. Luis, being older than me, felt guilty and embarrassed, thinking he had failed to protect me. A few years ago, we finally told our parents, but I wish we had spoken up sooner. Maybe something could have been done. Now, I never let my own kids out of my sight, and I always remind them they can tell me anything without fear of being judged, especially my son. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the southern part of West Virginia. For years, I've enjoyed backpacking and camping, exploring various trails in the nearby mountains. My closest friend, who lived just a few miles away, often joined me for these trips. We'd always plan one big hike in the fall, ranging from a few days to a full week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we had planned to hike across the range to a small lake on top of the mountains. But just before the trip, my friend had to cancel due to a work emergency. I had already taken time off from work and had everything packed, so I decided to go on the hike alone on Monday morning. I drove to a nearby trailhead and began my journey. This wasn't a typical recreational trail with clearly marked paths like the ones you might find on a short hike. These backpacking routes didn't have any defined trails, so I had to rely on maps, a compass, and landmarks to find my way. Normally, there's a large landmark like a unique rock formation in the distance that you aim for. Once you reach it, you can spot your next landmark and continue on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When it got dark on the second day, I set up camp, several hours away from reaching the ridge. I pitched my tent, built a fire, and heated up some food I had brought along. The sun had already set, and by 8 o'clock, I was inside the tent reading. I left the fire burning, planning to put it out before sleeping. About 20 minutes into reading, I heard the unmistakable sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I froze. My first thought was that a bear had smelled the food I had cooked earlier. But then, I didn't hear anything else. I quickly crawled out of the tent and shined my flashlight into the woods behind me. There was nothing there. I called out, hoping to scare away any animals, but I didn't hear any scurrying or movement. It was strange because the stick snapping sounded like something had stepped on it intentionally. I stood outside for a while, watching the area closely before putting out the fire and returning to the tent. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept listening for any further sounds. In the morning, I was surprised to find I had slept through the night. I packed up my gear and continued on toward the ridge. From there, it was a straight path to the lake. I hurried along, hoping to make it before dark so I wouldn't have to set up another campsite. I made it with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was stunning, well worth the hike. I walked around it for a while, taking in the beauty before setting up camp along the tree line near the water. As I sat by the fire, I kept hearing soft sounds coming from the trees behind me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but it felt strange. It almost sounded like footsteps, but I knew no one else was supposed to be out here. I would have noticed their camp when walking around the lake earlier. By then, it was too dark to see anything beyond a few feet, so searching around wasn't an option. After an hour, I got in my tent and laid down. Every few minutes, I would hear those soft footsteps again. They were faint enough to make me question what I was hearing, but it definitely sounded like someone walking. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. What felt like only an hour later, I woke to the sound of someone running away from my tent. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside, but by the time I looked in the direction of the footsteps, I only saw the distant back of whoever had been running. My heart was pounding. As I looked down, I noticed footprints all around my tent, as if someone had been circling it, searching the campsite. I immediately tried to get the campfire going again to better see my surroundings. I was scared. I was alone, miles away from help, and I didn't know what to do. I stayed by the fire, keeping a constant watch throughout the night. Thankfully, nothing else happened. In the morning, I took a few pictures of the lake before packing up and starting the hike back. I had planned to stay for an extra day, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I felt as though I was being watched. The hike back was uneventful, and I was relieved to make it without further incident. But as I continued my trek, I began to notice small things missing from my backpack. Items like food and a few tools. I always kept my bag close by, so I wondered if someone had snuck into my camp during the night and stolen from me while I was asleep. The thought still sends a chill down my spine. I took the job because it was supposed to be easy. Who wouldn't want to get paid to walk around the quiet national forest at night? Sure, there were the usual tasks, like checking on the few campers who dared to stay overnight, making sure they followed the rules, and occasionally dealing with a curious bear or raccoon. But overall, it seemed like the perfect job that would give me time to clear my head. I never expected that my first shift would be my last. Fernwood Forest wasn't large, nor well known. Tucked away in a secluded part of the state, it was a place where locals came to escape the noise of daily life. The forest had a few campsites, hiking trails, and a small lake that looked like it belonged on a postcard. I had heard the rumors about the place. Every small town has its ghost stories and urban legends. I laughed them off at the time, but now, I truly wish I hadn't been so quick to dismiss them. It was a clear, crisp night in late September when my nightmare began. The forest was quieter than usual, with only 2 occupied campsites. I started my patrol around 1 a.m., armed only with a flashlight, a walkie-talkie, and a thermos of coffee. I always thought it was overkill to carry the radio, but protocol was protocol. The first site I visited was occupied by a family of 4, a mother, father, and their 2 younger children. They were roasting marshmallows over a campfire, their laughter echoing through the trees. I checked in with them briefly, exchanged some small talk, and moved on. The second campsite was farther away, closer to the lake. An older man named Henry, a regular who enjoyed fishing and solitude, had set up his tent. When I arrived, he was already asleep, the fire's embers dying out. Satisfied that everything was in order, I returned to the main trail. It must have been around midnight when I heard it, a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from deep in the forest. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It sent a chill down my spine, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. I stopped, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, but saw nothing unusual. Shaking off the unease, I continued my patrol. The sound came again, louder this time and closer. It was a mix of a growl and a groan, primal, threatening. My heart raced in my chest as I turned toward the noise, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. Just beyond the edge of the light, I saw movement. A shadow slipped between the trees. It was tall and humanoid but distorted. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But then I saw the eyes, glowing, piercing, and sickly yellow. They seemed to bore into my soul with a cold, evil intelligence. The creature stepped into the light, and my breath caught. It stood over 7 feet tall, its skin pale and stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its limbs were long and spindly, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. Its mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Panic set in, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I bolted down the trail, my heart pounding, lungs burning. Behind me, I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps gaining on me. I fumbled for my walkie-talkie, desperate to call for help. My hand shook as I pressed the button, and my voice came out as a strangled whisper. "This is Sam. I need help. There's something in the forest. Something wrong." Static crackled through the radio, followed by my supervisor's calm voice. "Calm down, Sam. Where are you?" "Near the lake," I gasped. "It's following me." I didn't wait for his response. I kept running. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly with each step. The path stretched on forever. The trees seemed to close in around me. The creature's growls grew louder and more frantic. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it was closer than I ever thought it could be, its eyes glowing with predatory hunger. Up ahead, I saw a faint light, the ranger station. A surge of hope propelled me forward. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me and locking it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door, trying to steady my racing heart. I grabbed the radio again, my voice shaky. "I'm at the station. It's outside." There was a pause, and then Mike's voice came through, sounding concerned. He told me to stay inside and that he'd be there soon. I sank into my chair, my eyes fixed on the door. Outside, I could hear the creature moving around, its claws scraping against the walls. It let out a low, menacing growl that made my skin crawl. I looked around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on an old, rusty axe hanging on the wall. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I gripped the axe tightly, positioning myself by the door, ready to defend myself. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, the tension in the air so thick it could be cut with a knife. The creature prowled outside, its growls growing more agitated. Finally, I heard a vehicle approaching. Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "I'm here. Stay where you are." The creature was illuminated by the headlights of Mike's truck, and for a brief moment, I saw it in all its horror. Its skin glistened in the light, its eyes burning with rage. Mike stepped out of the truck, shotgun in hand. "Get away from the door," he shouted. I scrambled back as Mike fired a shot. The creature let out a roar and lunged at him. Another shot rang out, and the beast staggered but didn't fall. I watched in horror as it swiped at Mike, knocking him to the ground. I knew I had to act. Gripping the axe, I flung open the door and charged at the creature, screaming at the top of my lungs. It turned toward me, its eyes blazing with fury. I swung the axe with all my strength, the blade cutting into its side. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream and ran off into the forest. Pain shot through my body as I fell to the ground. It had managed to land a swipe on my knee. For a moment, everything went quiet. The creature released one final, shuddering scream as it disappeared into the forest. We reported the incident to the authorities, but the creature's body, if it had died, was never found. We never heard anything else about it. All that remained were deep gouges in the ground and a lingering sense of dread. They chalked it up to a bear attack, but we knew the truth. To this day, I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. I quit my job the next day and couldn't bring myself to step foot in that forest again. The memory of those glowing eyes and twisted grin still haunts me. I live in a small town in Wyoming, nestled in the Rocky Mountains. My house is just a few miles away from a massive national forest. It's a beautiful area, but it can feel incredibly lonely and overwhelming. That sense of solitude is part of why I love it, but after what happened, it's also why I'm scared. Last Saturday, I decided to take a late afternoon hike and maybe find a spot to camp. There's a trail I often visit that leads to a small clearing with a view of the valley. I brought along my dog, Max, a German Shepherd who's never scared of anything. We left around 3 p.m., planning to be back before sunset. The hike was peaceful, with the forest calm and quiet, except for the rustling leaves and occasional bird songs. Max was being his usual self, running ahead and circling back to me. He was perfect as my lookout. I loved the quiet of the day. It was everything I moved out here for. When we reached the clearing, I sat on a fallen log to catch my breath and enjoy the view, while Max kept sniffing around. After a few minutes, he froze in place, staring at the tree line on the other side of the clearing. His ears were up, and his body stiffened. "What's up, boy?" I asked, trying to see what he was looking at. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow between the trees. I squinted, thinking it might be a deer or something like that, but then it stepped into the clearing. It looked like a person, but not quite. It was tall and thin, with limbs that were far too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes were completely black. Max started growling, a low, threatening sound I had never heard from him before. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I noticed it was copying my movements from earlier, almost like it was replaying a video of me walking. Then it spoke. "Max, what's up, boy?" The voice was mine, but wrong, and it sent a chill down my spine. Max started barking fiercely. The figure stopped, tilted its head, and then turned around, disappearing into the trees. I didn't stick around to find out what it was doing. I grabbed Max's collar and ran down the trail, feeling the daylight fading. Any idea I had of camping there was gone. Every sound made me jump, and Max kept looking back, growling every so often. We made it home as the light disappeared. I locked all the doors and windows, which I never do. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light or another hiker messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and Max was restless, pacing the living room. Around 2 a.m., just as I was drifting off, I heard it. "Max, what's up, boy?" It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was my voice, and it was coming from outside, near the tree line. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep. When the sun came up, I grabbed Max and drove into town. I needed to be around people, somewhere that didn't feel so exposed. I told my friend Jake about it, and he just laughed, saying I'd been out in the woods too long. Maybe he's right. Maybe I need to leave the woods and move back to town. I haven't been back to that trail since. Whenever I think about hiking, camping, or fishing, I hear that voice again, and I can't bring myself to leave the house. I don't know what I saw, but I'm sure of one thing: it saw me. I've always enjoyed camping, especially during the fall when the leaves change colors and the air is crisp. So when my best friend, who I'll call Laura, invited me to go camping with her for her birthday, I couldn't say no. We packed up our things and headed out to a secluded spot in the woods that Laura's family had been visiting for years. As we hiked in, a feeling of calm washed over me, almost as if we were the only people left on Earth. The hike wasn't long, and when we got to the campsite, we got to work setting everything up. It didn't take long, and after we finished, we decided to go for a walk. We headed north, off the main trail, just exploring until we found a faint path we'd never seen before. Laura was surprised, saying there was nothing out here. We followed the path, which wound through the trees, eventually leading us to an old, run-down cabin. It was small and worn down, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Laura was excited to check it out, while I felt uneasy but also intrigued. When we stepped inside, it was clear no one had been there in years. We poked around, looking for anything that might tell us who had lived there, but we didn't find much. As we were about to leave, I noticed something strange in the corner of the room. A door I hadn't seen before. It was tiny and had a rusted padlock on it. I pointed it out to Laura, and we both grew curious. I knocked on the door, knowing no one was inside, but I wanted to be sure. Laura stepped outside and came back with a large rock, handing it to me. I smashed it against the lock, only needing a few hits to break it open. The door scraped along the floor as we pulled it back. Inside was pitch dark, and we couldn't see anything. Laura shined her flashlight into the room, revealing a staircase leading down. We both felt a chill run down our spines, but we told ourselves no one had been here in years, so there was nothing to fear. I led the way down the steep stairs, which only had about 8 or 10 steps before opening into a small room. What we saw next was unsettling. There were several small mattresses on the floor and some random furniture, but the mattresses looked almost new, like they'd been bought within the last 5 years. The sight of it sent a wave of fear over me, and we both rushed back upstairs, quickly shutting the door behind us. We stood there, confused and unsure of what we had just seen. We debated whether it was a crime scene, as it all seemed out of place. While we were talking, Laura suddenly shushed me. In the distance, we could hear footsteps approaching the cabin. They stopped right outside, but then, oddly, they continued walking without pausing. I could see the same confusion on Laura's face. Once the footsteps faded away, we ran back to our campsite and then hurried to Laura's house. We called the police just in case there was something more to it. To us, the fact that the person didn't stop meant they must have known the cabin. We weren't sure if it was something bad, so we let the authorities handle it. They searched the cabin and the surrounding area but found nothing unusual. They said it was a strange situation, but there wasn't enough to prove anything bad had happened there. Still, it became a hot topic in our town for a while, with everyone speculating about what the cabin had been used for. Eventually, the city decided to demolish it to stop people from visiting. It's never been figured out, and it probably never will be. But something inside me tells me that something terrible happened there. The voices near our camp seemed unrelated, but it all started when I drove home from college to work during the summer before heading back. I hadn't yet visited the only national forest in western Wisconsin, about 5 hours from my place. I took a friend along, and we left on a Saturday morning, around 10 a.m., and reached the forest by 3 p.m. The forest roads were in poor condition, making the drive longer than we'd planned. The mosquitoes in the area were awful this time of year, and since the Headwaters wilderness is mostly swampland and marsh, we ended up hiking for about 5 miles before stumbling upon a camping spot. It was located on an old, abandoned forest road that led to private land, about 4 miles in. I noticed this property wasn't part of the federal land on my Gaia GPS app. The road was overgrown with tall ostrich ferns, some up to 4 feet high, making the path narrow. There were limbs scattered everywhere, and every half mile it felt like we hit another big pothole. The area had a lot of dead wood, perfect for starting a fire. We set our packs down about a mile back and kept exploring, hoping to find something more interesting than a dense, quiet forest. As it started to get dark, we decided to turn back. While navigating around a fallen tree, we came across a 3-foot-tall shelter made of sticks, which appeared to have been carefully constructed. I'm a bit superstitious, so I thought it might be a nest or something similar. We decided to leave some wood as an offering before continuing our way. That night, after we had used an entire gallon of water to put out our fire and there was no wind, we noticed something strange. I heard footsteps around our tent after my friend returned from using the restroom. As I lay listening, I could make out the sound of something hitting the base of a tree in a steady, rhythmic pattern every 5 minutes or so, continuing through the night. I also caught a faint sound, almost like a giggle or a voice carried by the wind. The next morning, we checked everything out. Nothing unusual happened, but I couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with that nest we found. Maybe it was a trick or some playful spirit, or maybe I was just being overly cautious, letting my imagination get the best of me. This happened in 2021. My husband and our 3 children enjoy camping in a primitive style, and the closest place that allows this is Loyal Sauk State Forest. My husband and our dog left about an hour before the rest of us, and he chose a spot a little off the main trail. By the time we arrived, he had already set up camp, but my oldest, who was 12 at the time, and I both felt uneasy. Still, we pushed on and tried to enjoy our day together. Later on, my son and I had to walk back to the car for something we'd forgotten, about a 1/4 mile from our campsite. It's a straight line, so there was no way we could miss it, but as we walked, everything started to look unfamiliar, and that same unsettling feeling returned. We eventually reached a paved road that shouldn't have been there. I checked the map, but it didn't help, and my sense of discomfort only grew. I wanted to keep walking because the car had to be nearby, but my son began to cry and begged me to turn back. So we did, retracing our steps. Eventually, we made it back to camp. When I tried again to walk to the car, I took the same path we'd walked earlier, and somehow I found it. The rest of the afternoon felt wrong, though. There was no sound from birds or the wind, just silence. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't settle in, so I begged everyone to go to sleep before it got dark. I barely slept that night, kept awake by the eerie silence surrounding us. At around 3:30 a.m., I heard a mechanical sound, almost like a drone, but it was so loud it seemed to be right outside our tent. As I tried to get up and wake my husband to check it out, the sound stopped instantly. It didn't fade away like a drone would as it flew off. It just cut off the moment it heard any movement. I can't explain it. Normally, when we camp, there are all sorts of typical forest sounds, but the next day, when we moved to another site, the forest noises returned as they should. I should also mention that my dog was a nervous wreck the whole time we stayed at that first campsite. He kept pacing, looking around, and whining. Something wasn't right, but I can't even begin to explain what it was. There was definitely something strange going on. In the early 90s, my parents sent me to a summer camp in the woods of Vermont. The camp was called Camp Melton and was located near a series of small, artificial lakes known as spring lakes. It wasn't deep in the forest, but it wasn't exactly in the middle of town either. We all heard the stories of the local mythical creature, the Vermont beast, but the camp also had its own ghost stories to scare us. One was about a woman in white who was said to have jumped from a bridge on her wedding day, and another about Axe Happy Hank, a maniac who allegedly chopped up kids who strayed into the woods. Both stories were told to keep us from wandering off the campgrounds. I never encountered either of those legends, though. One night, I woke up in my bunk and heard something rustling in the bushes outside. The cabins were built with half walls, with screens all around except for the back wall. Inside, there were 8 bunk beds, 4 on each side. From my bunk, I could see right out through the screens. It was a pain when it rained since there were no shutters. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the bushes across from the front of the cabin, sweeping from the ground up. There was nothing in that direction except for the woods, as our cabin group was right at the edge of the camp. I didn't see anything, so I put the flashlight down and went back to bed. Then, a strange light appeared. It was bluish-white, flickering like a firefly. The light slowly followed the same path my flashlight had traced, from the bottom up, before disappearing. I was really scared, but I didn't want to wake the grumpy counselor. I figured she wouldn't believe me anyway since I was already known as a troublemaker. So, I just huddled deeper into my sleeping bag and tried to get back to sleep. I never saw the light again after that. My best guess is that it was just a firefly that thought my flashlight was another of its kind, even though the fireflies around there usually had a greenish glow to them. I've told this story a few times over the years, but I've never really gotten a solid answer from anyone. No one seems to know what really happened that night. I found this group recently and thought I'd share it, hoping someone might have some thoughts on it. I decided to spend a weekend camping in the remote woods, far from the distractions of everyday life. I was craving peace, a moment to clear my mind, and what better way to find it than by immersing myself in nature? After hours of hiking, I finally came across what seemed like the perfect spot. It was secluded, far from the main trail, beside a small, calm pond. The sunlight reflected off the water, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. It was serene, peaceful, and exactly what I needed. I spent the rest of the day setting up camp. I pitched my tent by the pond, gathered firewood for the night, and created a small fire pit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Everything was ready, and the worries I'd brought with me started to fade. I sat by the fire, the flames crackling and popping, watching the shadows stretch across the ground. I roasted a hot dog over the fire and ate it slowly, savoring the simplicity. As the sky grew dark, the stars began to shine brightly, twinkling against the deep blue. I leaned back and watched them while the fire warmed my face and the air around me cooled. The night felt peaceful, almost magical. Just me, the pond, the trees, and the open sky. For the first time in ages, I felt at ease. My mind quieted, and I relaxed into the moment. But then, as I sat there staring into the flickering flames, I got a strange feeling. For just a moment, I thought I wasn't completely alone. I glanced around, scanning the dark shapes of the trees, but I saw nothing unusual. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was my first night alone in the woods. Being a little nervous was normal, right? I threw another log on the fire and forced myself to relax. Eventually, tiredness crept in, and I decided it was time for bed. I made sure the fire was fully out, pouring water over the embers until they hissed and went dark. Then, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up behind me, and snuggled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The soft croak of frogs by the pond, the rustling leaves as the breeze blew through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Slowly, my eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted off to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was racing, though I had no idea why. The air in the tent felt unusually cold, and I shivered as I sat up, straining to listen. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest had disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. A chill ran down my spine, and a sense of dread crept in. Something wasn't right. I carefully unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat. The campfire, which I had made sure to put out, was burning again. The flames flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I knew I had put it out. I had watched the embers sizzle and die. So, how was it burning again? My heart pounded harder as I crawled out of the tent. The air had grown colder, and the silence felt suffocating. Something felt off. My gear, my backpack, my boots, even the small pot I had used was slightly moved. Not much, but enough to make me uneasy. My skin crawled as I scanned the darkness with my flashlight. The beam trembled in my hand as I shook, and the trees stood still, their branches unmoving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was out there, just beyond the light, watching. I turned my gaze to the pond and the shadows near the fire, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then I saw it, the tent zipper was halfway open. I knew I had closed it completely when I went to bed. I had heard the soft sound as I sealed myself inside. But now it was open. My stomach twisted with fear. Someone had been here. Someone had opened my tent while I was asleep. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. I added more wood to the fire whenever it started to die down, as if the light could keep whatever was out there at bay. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made my heart race, but I saw nothing, just darkness and shadows. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the campsite. I stumbled out of my chair, my body aching from the tension and lack of sleep. As I stretched, something caught my eye. Footprints. Large, bare footprints, deeply imprinted in the soft earth. They circled my tent, and the sight sent a shiver through me. Whoever or whatever had been here the night before had been pacing around my tent, watching me while I slept. Panic gripped me as I knelt to get a closer look. The prints were fresh, pressed into the damp earth, as if someone had been circling for hours. I could picture it. Someone or something slowly moving around, keeping watch while I slept. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I had to get out of there. I hurriedly packed my gear, my hands trembling as I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just beyond the trees. But the forest was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. As I stuffed my sleeping bag into my backpack, I felt the shadows shifting around me. The trees seemed to close in, and every snap of a twig made my pulse race. I could feel eyes on me. The forest was watching. Suddenly, I heard a branch snap behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the stillness of the woods. I forced myself to focus, to keep packing. I couldn't stay here any longer. Finally, everything was packed. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and took one last look at the campsite, the pond, the fire pit. It all seemed peaceful, but I knew better. Something was out there waiting for me to make a mistake. I turned and began walking, my legs unsteady, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. I walked as quickly as I could, trying to put distance between me and whatever was following me. The sounds of the forest felt muffled, as though the woods were closing in on me. I heard it again, another branch snapping, closer this time. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned, scanning the forest. There, between the trees, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, moving silently, deliberately. It was impossibly tall, blending into the forest as though it was a part of it. Terror gripped me and I turned, running. My feet pounded against the forest floor, my backpack slamming against my shoulders. I didn't care about the trail. I just needed to get away. The trees blurred around me, the shadows twisting. I could hear my ragged breathing as the forest closed in, branches reaching for me. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and fell hard. Pain shot through my knee, but I bit back a cry. I forced myself up, shaking, eyes darting around. Something was close, too close. I limped forward, every step echoing in my ears, the panic rising. After what felt like hours, I saw it, the main trail. A surge of relief washed over me, and I stumbled onto it, my legs trembling. I paused for a moment, catching my breath, but against my better judgment, I looked back. There it was again, the shadow slipping behind a tree. My heart raced and I turned, running again. I didn't stop until I was far down the trail, my body aching, my mind reeling. I knew one thing for sure. I had barely escaped, and whatever had been in those woods wasn't done with me. I kept running, my legs burning, my chest heaving. The fear weighed heavily on me, pushing me forward. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. couldn't stop. I had to get out. Suddenly, a rustling sound behind me made my blood run cold. I spun, eyes scanning the trees. There it was, a shadow, moving silently, blending with the darkness. It was closer now, tall and thin, moving gracefully from one tree to the next. Fear twisted my stomach, and I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain in my knee. The trail was uneven, and the ground was littered with roots and rocks, but I didn't care. I had to escape. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran, the world a blur of trees and shadows. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The rustling behind me grew louder, closer. The edge of the forest. That day, the woods felt different. My brother and I had come across an old, overgrown logging path. One of those trails you don't usually notice unless you're actively seeking something off the beaten track. That's exactly what we were doing. Two guys looking for a bit of adventure, or at least a distraction from the usual. The path that led away from the road was barely visible, hidden under ferns and decaying pine needles, but it had a strange pull, as if it wanted to be discovered. We laughed, calling it a shortcut, pretending like we weren't a bit uneasy, like brothers do when neither one wants to admit feeling off. The woods were cooler than normal, a chill that sank deep into our bones despite it being early summer. I tried to ignore the way the tall pines seemed to crowd us, their branches heavy with moss, their trunks looming over the path. The trail twisted and turned, and before we knew it, we had wandered farther than planned. It felt like we had been walking for hours when we stumbled into something that made us stop. A small clearing surrounded by ancient stones, covered in thick green moss. The stones formed a perfect circle, an eerie symmetry amid the chaotic wildness of the forest. My brother made a joke about druids, but his laughter faded quickly in the heavy silence that surrounded us. There was no breeze, no chirping birds, no buzzing insects, just an unnerving stillness that pressed in on us. We decided to take a break, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping over us. I told myself it was all in my head, that there was nothing to be afraid of. We sat on the damp ground, my brother rummaging through his bag for water. I glanced around, and that's when I felt it, the sensation that we weren't alone. The hairs on my arms stood up. It was a gut feeling, one you don't question. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there, just dark shadows and twisted trunks. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself it was just the silence getting to me. Then, as if the forest had drawn in a deep breath and exhaled darkness, the light around us began to fade. It wasn't gradual like a sunset. It happened all at once, like a switch was flipped, and my stomach dropped. The branches above seemed to knit together, and the clearing darkened. Shadows spread, swallowing the stones, and the chill in the air bit into my skin. I turned to my brother, about to ask if he felt it too, but my voice caught in my throat. He was gone. The spot where he had been sitting was empty, his bag still lying open on the ground. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to my feet and spun around in a slow circle. My eyes searched the trees. "Danny," I called, but my voice was muted, as if the forest itself was swallowing it. There was no echo, no response, just silence. My heart raced, and I shouted his name again, louder this time, but it felt like the sound was absorbed by the quiet. I stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, tripping over roots that clawed at the earth. I pushed through the branches, calling his name over and over. The woods became a blur, the trees towering impossibly high, their bark slick and dark. I felt something watching me, always just out of my sight, moving when I wasn't looking. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The light faded until I could barely see a few feet ahead. The forest twisted, guiding me, changing my path, making it impossible to tell which way I had come. The trail was gone, replaced by a tangle of roots and rocks shifting under my feet. I kept calling for Danny, my throat raw, my voice barely a whisper. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had taken over, the light returned, spilling down through the branches, turning the forest floor into patches of gold. I blinked, disoriented, trying to adjust. I spun around, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw him, my brother, standing at the edge of the clearing. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He looked at me, lips parted, as if about to speak, but no sound came out. And in that moment, I realized that whatever had happened, whatever had taken him, we weren't alone anymore. Something had followed us. Something that wore the forest like a cloak, something that watched and waited. I wasn't sure we were going to make it out. The forest felt alive, twisting paths and shadows leading me in circles. Every direction looked the same. Tall, skeletal pines, their branches tangled together, blocking out the light. I kept moving, but I had no idea where I was going. I called out for my brother, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming silence. I stumbled over roots, my heart racing, my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't long before I began hearing whispers, faint at first, like wind moving through the trees. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could hear words. My name, repeated from every direction. Danny's voice. It sounded like him, but something was off. It made my skin crawl. I followed the sound, stumbling through the woods, my legs heavy, my muscles aching. The whispers circled me, always just out of reach, leading me deeper into the forest. Branches brushed against my skin, snagging my clothes, as if trying to stop me or guide me. I couldn't tell which. Time seemed to lose meaning as the forest twisted around me, paths splitting in every direction. None were familiar. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until the world was nothing but shadows, with faint light filtering through the leaves. I felt something watching me, always just beyond my sight, always moving when I wasn't looking. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take another step, I stumbled into another clearing. It was small, surrounded by trees with branches that wove together overhead. The light was dim, but there was something or someone standing at the center. My breath caught in my throat as I blinked, trying to focus. It was Danny standing there, his back to me, his head bowed. "Danny," I whispered. He didn't move. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, the air heavy around me. "Danny," I called again, louder this time. He turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes wide. He looked at me, and for a moment, everything seemed okay. But then he spoke. The words that came out weren't his. They were mine, twisted and wrong, echoing back at me from the shadows. The clearing seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer, the air growing colder. I took a step back, my stomach twisting, and that's when I knew I had to get out. Whatever had taken my brother, whatever had been in that forest, it was playing with me, leading me deeper, keeping me lost. I turned, my legs weak, my body trembling, and I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape. The forest fought me, branches snagging, roots tangling, but I pushed on. The whispers faded. The darkness lifted, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. I stumbled out of the trees into the bright sunlight, the air fresh and cold. I gasped, my chest heaving, my heart racing. I looked around, disoriented, and then I saw it. The car parked at the edge of the clearing, my brother standing beside it. His face was pale, his eyes wide. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How had I ended up back here? Felt impossible. Danny stood there, staring at me, his expression one of shock and confusion. He looked like he had seen something beyond understanding, something that had shaken him to his core. "Danny!" I shouted. My voice cracked and raw, but there was relief in it too. Desperation, hope. I stumbled toward him, my legs shaking, weak from running for what felt like miles. He turned to me, tears streaking down his face. His lips trembled as he said my name. "Where were you?" He choked out, his voice breaking. I thought you were gone." I opened my mouth to explain, but how could I? How could I explain the whispers, the way the forest twisted around me, the feeling of something following, of something that had worn his face and spoken in my voice? The words wouldn't come. I just shook my head, my eyes burning as I looked at him. "We have to go," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't argue. He turned, fumbling for the car keys. His hands shook as he unlocked the door. I glanced back at the woods, the trees standing like dark sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. There was something there, just beyond the tree line, something that moved in the shadows, something that was watching us. I could feel it, a cold weight pressing down on my chest, a warning that we weren't safe. Not yet. Danny got the door open, and I practically threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. He climbed in after me, his hands still trembling as he shoved the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the sound breaking the silence that had settled around us. I kept my eyes on the forest as Danny drove the car forward, the tires skidding slightly on the loose dirt. "Don't look back," I whispered. Ever since my uncle purchased the land about 40 years ago, it had been a sprawling 25 acres located far from any town, deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. The trees were thick and towering, and sometimes even the sky seemed to darken in a strange way. He told everyone he wanted a place to escape, to hunt, fish, and live simply like people used to, but something always felt off about that land from the beginning. I couldn't quite figure it out, but it always felt as if we weren't alone, even when there wasn't another person in sight. Before my uncle bought it, there had been an old logging camp there, and stories about it had been passed down. Stories of people disappearing and accidents happening too often. My uncle dismissed them as nothing but tales, but I think deep down, he understood there was more to it. And before that, early settlers had performed odd rituals on the land. I remember him mentioning finding old symbols carved into the bigger trees and piles of stones arranged in strange circles, almost as if they were trying to keep something in, or perhaps keep something out. Even the local indigenous people avoided it. They called it the place of the shadow, and knew better than to disturb whatever was there. Still, Uncle Jack was determined. He built a cabin with his own hands, a rough, creaky structure that groaned whenever the wind blew. He added a smokehouse and even a lookout tower. But no matter what he did, the land remained wild, as if it was fighting back, as if it didn't want us there. Whenever I wandered off alone, I could feel it. The air would grow colder, and a deep unease would settle in my stomach, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard to dismiss something that seemed to follow you no matter where you went. The first time I knew something was wrong, I was just a kid, around 12 or 13. I was walking along an old game trail when I heard what sounded like a whimper. At first, I thought it was our dog, Buck, but Buck had been gone for over a year. Still, the sound was so familiar. I turned around, and there he was, or at least I thought it was him. He was standing in the shadows, but something wasn't right. His fur was patchy, and his eyes, they didn't look like the warm brown ones I remembered. They were pale, almost glowing. He stared at me for what felt like forever, and I just stood there, frozen. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I ran back to the cabin, heart pounding. I tried telling Uncle Jack, but he just laughed it off, saying the woods had a way of playing tricks on people. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen wasn't a trick. It was something else, something that didn't want us there. Over the years, things only grew stranger. The land never felt like it belonged to us. It felt as though it was watching and waiting, reminding us that we were intruders. By the winter of 2023, things had gotten worse. Uncle Jack and my cousin Sam spent most weekends at the cabin, hunting and trying to make it feel like home, but the land seemed to push back at every turn. One morning, they came back looking spooked. Sam wouldn't talk about it, but Uncle Jack finally shared what had happened. They found animal bones arranged in front of the cabin door, in a perfect star shape with lines crossing through it. It was too precise to be random. Uncle Jack tried to explain it away as coyotes, but I could tell he didn't believe that himself. The marks on the cabin walls were even worse. Long, jagged scratches as if something had tried to claw its way inside. These weren't marks left by raccoons or bears. They went all the way up to the roof. Sam suggested setting up cameras to figure out what was going on, so they installed a few motion sensors around the cabin. When they returned the next weekend, Sam thought they'd catch some wild animals on film, but when they checked the footage, all they found was static and strange flashes of light. It was as though the cameras had gone haywire during the night. The most bizarre part came when they saw a fleeting image. A tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It moved so quickly that by the time they replayed the clip, it was gone. Uncle Jack tried to brush it off, but Sam was shaken. He said it looked like a person, but not quite right. Too tall, too thin, and the way it moved, it wasn't natural. That wasn't the only weird thing. One night, Uncle Jack woke to scratching noises on the roof. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check, and what he found made his stomach turn. A fox was hanging from the branches above the cabin, its eyes wide open and its face frozen in terror. It hadn't been attacked. It looked as though it had simply died of fear. That same night, the cameras went dead. Batteries drained despite being replaced just before. The worst thing happened while Uncle Jack was sitting up in the lookout tower. It was quiet, almost peaceful, until he heard someone whispering his name. It was soft, like the wind, but he knew the voice. It was his brother's voice, the one who had died years ago. The voice called him to come down, and Uncle Jack said he almost went down, as if in a trance. But then, just as suddenly, he snapped out of it, and the whispering stopped. He didn't tell Sam, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. The next weekend, Sam couldn't take it anymore. He was tired of feeling afraid, tired of whatever was tormenting us. He told Uncle Jack he was going to explore the far corner of the property, the part no one ever visited. It was dense with old trees that twisted together, blocking out the sun, and the ground was covered in thick vines. It felt like a place that didn't want to be found. I went with him. I wasn't about to let Sam go alone, even though I was terrified of what we might discover. As we made our way through the woods, the air grew colder with every step. It was deathly quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our boots crunching on leaves and our breathing. Eventually, we came upon a small clearing, and that's when we saw them, the graves. There were about a dozen, neatly arranged in rows, each marked by a stack of stones. The earth looked like it had been disturbed not long ago. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew deep down we weren't supposed to be there. Sam must have felt it too, because he stood there, pale, staring at the graves. He whispered, "We need to leave." I nodded, but we couldn't move right away. It felt as though something was holding us there, daring us to step closer. Finally, we turned and made our way back to the cabin. Uncle Jack didn't believe us at first, but Sam insisted on showing him the graves. The next morning, we all went back. Uncle Jack brought his metal detector, likely hoping to find something that could explain what we had seen, maybe old tools or something that made sense of it all. But when he passed the detector over the graves, it didn't react, not until we reached the last grave, the one a little further from the others. started beeping wildly. Uncle Jack frowned and tried again, but the beeping wouldn't stop. The air around us felt thick, like it was hard to breathe. I could see the fear in Sam's eyes. We weren't supposed to be here. Uncle Jack wanted to dig, but Sam and I begged him not to. There was something wrong about that place. Eventually, Uncle Jack agreed and we left the graves alone. We walked back to the cabin in silence, none of us knowing what to say. After that day, Uncle Jack stopped staying at the cabin. He moved his camper closer to town, near the road. Sam stopped coming out altogether, and I couldn't blame him. Whatever was out there, whatever was buried in those graves, it didn't want us there, and now we knew better than to try to force it. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. My friends and I had planned to spend a few days in a remote national forest, far from everything. I decided to arrive a day earlier to set up camp and get everything ready for their arrival. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to enjoy some alone time in nature before everyone else showed up. So, I packed up my car and set off, eager to begin the adventure. The road into the forest was long and winding, twisting deeper into the woods with every turn. The further I drove, the more the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches casting long shadows across the road as the sun began to set. The fading light made the forest look darker and more mysterious. I tried to tell myself it was beautiful, but a sense of unease started creeping in. The road kept getting narrower, and it felt like I was leaving the world behind. Eventually, I reached what I thought was our campsite. It had everything I expected: a fire pit, logs arranged in a circle, and signs that someone had camped there recently. It seemed perfect, almost like it had been waiting for me. I got out of the car and stretched, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. I unloaded my gear and started setting up my tent. As I worked, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, purple, and finally a deep, starless black. The only light came from my lantern and the small fire I managed to start. The fire crackled, and I sat down on one of the logs, feeling the warmth against the cool evening air. It should have been relaxing, but as the night went on, an unsettling feeling grew stronger. It was as though I wasn't truly alone, like someone was watching me just beyond the circle of light. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, I was alone in the middle of the forest, an easy place for the imagination to run wild. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time a branch snapped or leaves rustled, my heart skipped a beat. I kept glancing into the darkness, straining my eyes to see if anything was out there, but all I could see were shadows. It felt like something was lurking just beyond my vision, hiding in the dark. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just the forest. There was nothing out there. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay down, listening to the sounds of the forest. The fire outside slowly burned down to embers, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of being watched lingered, as if there were eyes in the dark, staring at me, waiting. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it whispering. It was faint, like the voices were far away, but it was there, drifting through the darkness. I held my breath, trying to listen. The whispers seemed to come from all around me, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was a mix of voices, men and women, murmuring words I couldn't understand. My skin prickled with fear, and I felt frozen, unable to move. Slowly, I unzipped my sleeping bag and sat up, my hands shaking. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling in the dark until I found it. I took a deep breath and turned it on. The light flickered for a moment before it steadied. The whispers stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire was almost out, just a few glowing embers left. Everything was still. My eyes scanned the edge of the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Shadowy figures standing just beyond the campsite, barely visible in the darkness. There were 5 or 6 of them, maybe more. They stood there, not moving, just watching me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, and my throat felt tight. I tried to call out, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling. The figures didn't move. They didn't answer. They just stood there, staring. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight tighter. I shined it toward them. The beam flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw one of them step closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly pointed the light back at them, but they were gone. The clearing was empty, as if they had never been there. I closed the tent quickly, zipping it up as fast as I could. I clutched the flashlight, my hands trembling, and listened for any sound. The whispers didn't return, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every little sound making my heart jump. The rustling of leaves, the crack of a branch. It all made me feel like they were still out there, just beyond the tent, waiting. I kept the flashlight on, the weak beam barely lighting up the inside of the tent. I repeated to myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something out there, something watching me, and I had no idea what it wanted. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt like I could breathe again. I unzipped the tent, cautiously peering out to make sure the campsite was empty. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of those shadowy figures. Nothing. The clearing looked calm and peaceful, as if nothing had happened the night before. The fire was nothing more than a pile of cold ashes now, and everything was quiet, too quiet. I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, but the fear that had gripped me during the night was too real to ignore. I packed up my things as quickly as I could. My hands were still trembling, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures again. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but the unease never left. I knew I had to get out of there. I was supposed to meet my friends that morning, and I needed to find them. I grabbed the map, my eyes scanning the lines and markings. That's when I realized it. I was at the wrong campsite. My heart sank. The spot I was supposed to be at was miles away, deeper into the forest. I had made a mistake and spent the entire night alone in the wrong place. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought about it. I had no idea whose campsite this was, or if those figures had anything to do with it. I shoved the map back into my bag, my mind racing. I needed to leave now. I started hiking back to my car. My footsteps hurried and uneven. The forest was still. The only sounds came from my own movement. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those figures were still out there, hidden among the trees, following me. I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on getting back to the road. When I finally reached my car, I let out a shaky breath. I tossed my gear into the back seat and got in, locking the doors behind me. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine. I needed to find my friends and tell them what had happened. I drove along the narrow forest road, my eyes scanning the trees, half expecting to see those shadowy figures standing among them. The feeling of dread still clung to me like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. When I found my friends at the real campsite, they noticed something was off. They asked why I looked so shaken, and I told them everything, the whispers, the figures, the feeling of being watched. One of my friends went pale. He looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. "You haven't heard the stories, have you? People say there are watchers in these woods. Campers have disappeared around here." My stomach turned, and a chill ran through me. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The forest that had seemed so inviting now felt hostile, like it was hiding something terrible. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in those dark woods, the figures were still there, waiting for their next visitor, waiting for someone who might not be as lucky as I had been. The hike started like any other, a spontaneous adventure with my girlfriend Emma. We were tired of the usual trails and eager to explore something new. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the woods, lighting up the leaves in shades of gold and green. The crisp, cool air was filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, making us feel like the only people in the world. We let our curiosity lead us off the main path, eager to discover hidden corners of the forest. At first, it was thrilling, each step taking us further into the unknown. But soon, we found something unusual. From a distance, it looked like a tree stump, but as we got closer, we realized it was no part of the forest. It was an old mannequin propped against a tree, its plastic limbs covered in dirt and tangled with green moss. One arm was missing, and a tattered, weathered hat was crooked on its head. It was out of place, making us laugh nervously. Maybe it was a prank, some teenager's joke. We kept walking, but the air started to feel colder, and the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches twisting in strange shapes. The lively sounds of birds faded, and an unsettling silence filled the air. It felt as if the forest was watching us. We pushed through the branches, hoping to find something to lead us back to the trail. That's when we saw it. A second mannequin, half buried under a pile of leaves. Its face stared up at the sky, vacant and lifeless. A cold shiver ran down my spine. This no longer felt like a joke. It felt intentional. I glanced at Emma, who tried to smile, but her eyes were full of fear. She hugged herself tightly, breathing in short, shaky gasps. "Let's keep going," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was racing. We pressed on, trying to shake off the unease, but soon we found a third mannequin. It was sitting on a rock, its head tilted to the side, its cracked face almost looking like it was alive. Emma grabbed my hand tightly, squeezing it so hard it hurt. "Okay, this is getting weird," she whispered. I nodded, my stomach turning as I scanned the darkening forest. The quiet was suffocating. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our breath and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We decided to turn back, but the woods seemed unfamiliar, as though the trees had shifted and twisted to trap us. The air grew thicker, pressing down on us, as if the forest itself was alive. Panic set in when we saw another mannequin standing in our way. This one was upright, staring at us with those same empty eyes. It hadn't been there before. My pulse quickened, and Emma's hand trembled in mine. The silence felt heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. "We need to go now," she said, her voice tight with fear. I didn't argue. We turned and started running, but it felt like the mannequins were multiplying around us. One was leaning against a tree, another peeked from behind a bush, and yet another lay across the path as if it had fallen from the sky. My breath was ragged, and I swore I saw one shift ever so slightly, watching us. The thought that they might be moving made my skin crawl. We ran faster, branches scratching at our faces, our feet tripping over roots. The mannequins were everywhere, appearing just ahead, their faces eerily changing as we passed. One had its head tilted back, its mouth open in a silent scream. Emma's hand was a vice around mine, her breathing sharp and frantic. "Don't stop," I gasped, barely able to hear myself over the pounding of my heart. The forest seemed to close in on us, the branches grabbing at our hair, slapping against our arms. The mannequins were relentless, standing like eerie sentinels, blocking every turn. My mind raced with questions: who put them here and why? But there was no time to think, only to run. We ran until the forest finally opened up to the main trail. We stumbled out, gasping for air, our clothes torn and faces scratched. The woods around us were calm, bathed in the gentle light of the setting sun. The mannequins were gone, as if they'd never been there. I turned back, half expecting to see one lurking in the shadows, but there was only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was a mocking contrast to the terror we had just felt. Neither of us spoke as we hurried to the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, every creak and rustle from the forest making me flinch. Emma's eyes were wide, darting nervously around us. Finally, we were inside, the doors locked, the car engine roaring to life. The sound shattered the silence, grounding us in reality. We sped away, leaving that haunted place behind. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in thought. The familiar streets of the town brought a fleeting sense of safety, though it felt fragile. I parked in Emma's driveway, and for a moment, neither of us moved. She turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they'll come here?" I swallowed hard, wanting to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. "I don't know," I said finally, "but we'll be okay." She nodded, though doubt clouded her eyes. She kissed my cheek and slipped out of the car, hurrying inside. I waited until the door was locked behind her before I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. That night, sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those mannequins, their shifting faces, watching us. The sound of leaves rustling outside my window kept me on edge, the creak of floorboards making my heart race. I checked the yard more than once, but it was always empty. Still, the feeling lingered, the sense that something was out there, waiting. Weeks passed, but the memory didn't fade. I haven't dared to return to that forest. And sometimes, when the night is especially still, I hear a faint rustle, a whisper of movement outside my window. I wonder if they followed us, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I've tried to convince myself that it's just in my head, that fear plays tricks on us, but on those nights, when the air feels heavy and the shadows move under the pale moonlight, I can't help but stay awake, listening, just in case. I took a break from camping for a few years, but recently I decided to go on a trip again. There were 4 of us in total, some friends who had camped with me before and one of their new fiancés. I reserved a familiar campsite, but it looked quite different from how I remembered. The trees seemed healthier, bushes were thicker, and the greenery was more vibrant and plentiful. The paths that used to wind through the woods around the campsite were now fully overgrown. It seemed like people had forgotten about this place for a while, probably because of the lockdown, so the forest reclaimed its space. My friends, though, didn't seem to appreciate this change. In the past, we'd all agreed to respect the woods, but this time they were behaving differently. I couldn't completely blame them. The last few years have been rough, and it's understandable to want to unwind. Still, it's essential to remember that you're a guest in nature's territory. But as soon as we set up, my friends started acting recklessly, snapping branches that were supposedly in the way, drinking way too much beer and tossing the cans into the woods, and even spreading hot coals from the fire pit around the campsite, watching the sparks catch and stomping them out right before they spread. I got mad and told them to stop, but they just pushed a drink into my hand and told me to relax. I tried to enjoy myself, but as night fell, I started to feel more and more uneasy. Everyone else was sitting around the fire, but I decided to go to bed early. I couldn't shake off the bad mood, and their loud, pointless chatter wasn't helping. I didn't check the time, but it was late when they finally quieted down. It felt like the whole forest let out a sigh once they settled down. I lay there listening to the sounds of insects, being the last one awake. After a while, I got up to use the bathroom one last time. I slipped out of the tent and walked over to the edge of the trees. Naturally, my gaze drifted into the darkness, where the moonlight peeked through the branches. As I looked into the shadows, I suddenly noticed a pair of eyes staring back at me, almost glowing white. I jumped in surprise, looked away for a split second, and when I looked back, the eyes were closer. They were close enough now that I could make out a little more detail in the moonlight. It was a figure standing out there in the open. Something about them made my skin crawl, but I couldn't bring myself to call out. Eventually, I managed to stammer, "Who's there?" There was no response, so I thought about shining my flashlight on them. As I fumbled in my pocket, looking away briefly, I clicked on the light and pointed it at them. They had moved again, about 10 feet closer, and now there were only 30 feet between us. I cursed under my breath in fear, but could see more clearly now. It looked just like my friend's fiancée, wearing the same clothes she had on earlier, but her eyes weren't reflecting light normally, and her stance looked unnatural, as if she was being held up by invisible strings. "Haley," I called out. "What are you doing?" After a pause, she finally spoke, but her words sent a chill down my spine. She repeated my words back to me in my exact voice. It was uncanny, as if I was hearing myself. Haley didn't have any talent for impressions or mimicry, so I was completely unnerved. In a confused state, I took a step back, and she mirrored my movement exactly, stepping forward in sync with me. I stopped, wondering if maybe she was unwell. "It's late," I said slowly. "You shouldn't be out of your tent. Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer in her own voice, but repeated my words, again in my exact tone. "You shouldn't be out of your tent." A chill ran through me, and I knew this was beyond anything I could handle alone. I started backing away towards the tents, keeping my eyes on her as she followed each of my steps, almost gliding forward like a puppet. When I reached my friend's tent, she was past the tree line, standing in the open. I began pounding on the canvas, shouting, "Steve, wake up! We need to help Haley. Get up!" Steve's groggy face appeared as he unzipped the tent, looking annoyed. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Haley's here." He pulled back the flap, revealing Haley asleep in her sleeping bag, just starting to stir from the noise. My mind reeled as I muttered, "But she was just out there." I whipped around and shone my light back to where I'd seen her, or whatever it was, but there was nothing, not a trace. Steve looked at me, concerned, and asked if I was okay, pointing into the woods, where it was now empty. I couldn't calm down and tried to explain, but Steve dismissed it, telling me to get some rest. He zipped up his tent, but I couldn't bear to go back to mine. I ended up sitting by the fire, stirring the embers to keep it going, keeping watch through the night. Every little sound made my heart race, expecting those eerie eyes to reappear. At dawn, I'd had enough. I woke everyone up, insisting we pack up and leave. Despite their complaints, I was firm this trip was over. Nobody took me seriously, and they tried to brush it off as my imagination. But since I'd driven, they had no choice but to come along. The drive back was silent, and since then, I haven't been on good terms with any of them. They want me to get my head checked, but I know I'm not imagining things. If anyone has heard of something like this, I'd love to know more. As far as I can tell, something out there got comfortable with humans being away for a while, and my friend's behavior wasn't exactly a warm welcome back. Or maybe I really am losing my mind. One thing's for sure, I'm not planning on camping again. The second time, I unexpectedly encountered someone deep in the woods. It could have gone far worse. I was camping again with the same two friends from my last trip, but this time we had a fourth friend with us. He wasn't a former scout like the rest of us, but he was a close buddy. This trip was more intense. We drove to South Carolina for 5 days and 4 nights, and we had a very isolated campsite all to ourselves. After driving a few miles down a dirt road, we parked in a loop at the end and then hiked down the hill. The campsite was on a raised riverbank, surrounded by thick trees. I can't recall the exact time of year, but it was hot and dry, so the river was mostly shallow, barely reaching ankle height in many places, though some areas had deeper pools. The landscape was different from what we were used to, mountainous and full of unusual plants. It felt strange to us city folk, but added to the thrill. We'd brought fishing gear and planned to explore the river, hoping to catch something. I didn't have much luck as a newbie fisherman, though, especially compared to my friends. By the second or third day, the close quarters were starting to wear on us. That's when someone suggested crossing the border to North Carolina to visit a spot called Sliding Rock. Everyone else was on board, though I wasn't that interested. We made a risky choice then, going against the basic rule in Scouts about the buddy system, never going off alone in the wilderness. But since we hadn't faced any trouble in the first 48 hours, we decided the 3 of them would head out, and I'd stay at the campsite alone. I knew it wasn't the smartest idea, especially with my phone battery nearly dead, but they left me the keys to the other car in case of emergency. Oddly, I enjoyed having the place to myself. I cooked some cheesy grits over the fire, read a bit, washed the pot in the river nearby, and even caught my first fish, a small catfish that went for my leftover grits. I sent a picture to my friends, then let the fish go and headed further downriver to try my luck again. About a quarter mile down, I cast my line into a rapid and managed to catch a baby smallmouth bass. The water was too shallow for big fish, so we were mostly reeling in little ones. After I let the bass go, I sat on a rock to relax and enjoy the view. That's when the hair on my neck stood up. I realized I was all alone, far from home, in unfamiliar Appalachian territory. A sudden crack of a branch from the steep woods on the riverbank startled me. I stood up, scanning the area, but saw nothing. Then, looking down, I noticed my legs were covered in tiny leeches. Panicking, I started pulling them off and then made my way back to camp. On the way, I jumped onto a bank, landing hard on a cypress root, bruising my foot. I was starting to feel uneasy, wondering if I'd gone beyond my comfort level out there alone. Being more cautious, I safely returned to camp. Still alone and worried about the leeches, I stripped down to check myself thoroughly using the camp's only mirror. Once I was sure I was leech-free, I dressed, relaxed in my hammock with a beer and a smoke, and waited for my friends to return. When they got back, we shared stories of what we'd each been up to. After a bit, it was decided that I and our friend who wasn't a scout would head to the car to charge our phones. We were gone for about 45 minutes. When we returned, I saw him. There was a man standing in the river by our camp. He was talking to our 2 friends, and I could tell they were uncomfortable, standing stiffly as they waited for us to come back so they'd have strength in numbers. This guy looked like a mountain man, carrying everything he owned in his backpack. I didn't get close enough to hear him, but he was hard to understand anyway, missing quite a few teeth. Later, my friends told me his name was Bo, and he claimed to own the entire region. He told them we were welcome to stay as long as we showed respect. Then he mentioned that he'd seen me in the river earlier and was planning to approach until he noticed I'd run off. I realized he'd probably been watching me the entire time, maybe even while I'd stripped down by the river. His behavior felt odd, and he seemed a bit off. I'm relieved he didn't try to approach me while I was alone. Things could have ended differently if he'd decided to act on the chance to take any supplies or worse. My friend said he'd been inching closer to our camp until we all regrouped, at which point he backed off, a hint that he might not have had the best intentions. Eventually, we convinced Bo to leave, but we weren't sure he was truly gone. For the rest of our stay, we couldn't shake the feeling he might be lurking nearby, watching us from the shadows. We took turns keeping watch overnight just in case. He never returned, but the eerie screech of an owl piercing the silence wasn't exactly the comforting sound I wanted to hear alone in the dark. Back in the day, my friends and I used to plan camping trips out in the woods every so often. Since we had that shared history, things generally went smoothly. However, there was one thing our Daisy Scouts never prepared us for: running into people while camping. We were always trained to watch out for wild animals, poisonous plants, and venomous insects, but no one warned us that you could meet strangers deep in the woods. I've had a number of encounters with strangers while camping, and while some are amusing, there are two that really stand out because they were unsettling. The first took place in Florida in early January. Two friends and I booked a low-cost, primitive campsite for the weekend. When we arrived, we realized the site wasn't exactly secluded. It was located right on a dirt road, only a few miles from a rural highway. There were dozens of campsites along the path, most of which were empty, but about a quarter-mile down, we saw a family who seemed to be living there. Directly across from us was a strange man camping out of his Subaru. He didn't say a word while we set up camp, but we all noticed he was watching us. He had a large machete hanging from his hip. From his overall vibe, we figured he was someone who preferred to spend time alone in the woods, either for his own peace of mind or to avoid others. He kept his distance for most of the day, but we were only about 30 feet away from him, so we assumed he was probably listening to us. Thankfully, the first night passed without incident. On the second day, he started warming up to us. One of my buddies and I went into the woods to gather firewood, and the man told us where we could find better wood, instead of the rotting stuff we were picking up. We considered it, but he seemed too off for us to actually take his advice. He stuttered a lot, drooled, and nervously fidgeted with the machete, which made us feel uneasy. Still, we figured he was harmless, and we thought he'd be an interesting neighbor for the weekend. Since we were 3 against 1, we didn't think he posed a threat. As the day went on, things took a strange turn. It started with one car parking near the Machete Man's campsite. We all watched to see how he'd react. He was clearly uncomfortable, but it didn't stop there. More cars kept arriving, 1 by 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5, until a group of city folk had booked 3 campsites next to each other. The Machete Man didn't seem too happy about this. He kept glaring at them, though he tried to act normal. His tension was palpable. Things nearly escalated when 2 dogs appeared, one of which was running around without a leash. It didn't take long for the dog to rush over to the Machete Man's campsite and start jumping on him. The man stood frozen, like he was doing everything he could to resist pulling out his machete. We could see him trying not to lash out. The dog's owner quickly grabbed the animal, and that's when we heard something alarming. "Next time that damn dog comes over here, I'll shoot it," the man muttered. He seemed to want to send a message to the city folk, but surprisingly, they didn't seem too bothered. They kept the dog on a leash after that, but as night fell, they became more intrusive. Their dog barked non-stop, and the noise from their conversations became so loud that we could hear every word, even from a distance. We spent the night whispering and making fun of them, repeating some of the ridiculous things they said. One of my friends even did an impression of the most obnoxious of the bunch. Once the fire died down and the temperature dropped, we decided to call it a night and crawled into our hammocks. It was pretty cold, even by Floridian standards, and I didn't feel like getting up when I woke up at dawn, so I stayed in bed a bit longer. When I opened my eyes again, I saw my friend by the fire pit, trying to get the embers from last night to catch. I wasn't planning on getting up until the fire was going, so I shut my eyes again. Then I heard voices. My eyes flew open when I realized one of the voices was the Machete Man's. He was standing right over my friend, hand on his machete as usual. I pretended to stay asleep and listened to their conversation from my hammock. "Which one of you is doing that dumbass voice?" he asked. My friend stammered, then admitted it was him. There was a long pause before the machete man finally spoke again. "Man," he said, "you guys had me rolling in my tent last night." My friend let out a relieved sigh. "Yeah, we thought it was funny too," he replied. That's when the machete man leaned in and muttered something else. "I'm serious, guys. I was this close. If you hadn't got me laughing like that, I was about 10 seconds away from going over there with a gun and making them shut up." My friend didn't know how to respond, and the man continued. "I hate when those city people come out here. They should stay in Orlando. You guys ain't from there, are you?" "No, we're not from Orlando," my friend lied. "We're from Gainesville." "Ah, that's not too bad," the machete man said. "Well, I'm going to try to get them to leave. See you guys later." He turned and walked back to his camp. As soon as he was out of earshot, my friend looked at me wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, man. Good thing we're leaving today," I said. Our other friend woke up just then and crawled out of his hammock, totally unaware until we filled him in. We all agreed to cut the trip short. We packed up and left before 10 a.m. It felt like we were abandoning those people to their fate, and one of us joked, "What if we get home and hear on the news that some guy shot up a whole campsite full of people from Orlando?" Thankfully, that never happened, but the whole situation left us uneasy. It made me wonder what might have happened if we hadn't kept our sense of humor. We certainly weren't prepared for it, but we handled it as best as we could. Nobody expects to be crowded while primitive camping, but sadly, it wasn't our last experience with hermits in the woods. Back in 2012, my close friend and I went for a hike on one of the local mountains late in the afternoon. We were looking to get some exercise since we were both bored. The hike up was uneventful, with just a few kangaroos spotted along the way. The view from the top was beautiful, a perfect place to chill. After the sun set, we pulled out our flashlights and headlamps, carefully making our way down the mountain toward town. Again, not much happened on the way back except for some strange noises and a few active kangaroos and other wildlife. About 3/4 of the way down, we decided to stop for a breather, which was odd since we weren't very tired from our trek up and had rested plenty at the summit. However, we both felt unusually drained. Our backpacks were lighter after eating some snacks, but it still seemed odd. Then we noticed it, a dead silence. There were no crickets, no wildlife sounds at all. This eerie quiet made us feel uneasy, so we picked up our pace. When we reached the bottom, it was as if the sound had returned. We continued our conversation, joking about random topics, and moved aside for an occasional car. A couple of kilometers later, we started hearing weird noises again, and we noticed that everything else had gone silent once more. This time, as fatigue hit me, my adrenaline spiked. I remembered that this had happened before. Then we heard it, a low, raspy roar coming from up ahead and to the right in the woods. I had no idea what it could be, but I knew it wasn't a sound a human could make. As we drew nearer, we heard crashing sounds where we'd first heard the roar, followed by the horrible sound of an animal in pain. Up until that point, we had switched off our lights and were creeping along the road, but curiosity got the better of us. We shone our torches toward the source of those unsettling noises. What we saw nearly made me run away. If my friend hadn't been there, I might have bolted back to town. We tried to act tough, but all we could do was grip our knives and stare, confused, at the creature staring right back at us. To make matters worse, this thing had a dead, nearly full-grown kangaroo in its mouth, or what was left of it. Anyway, it looked like it had been gutted alive and was still twitching. Every instinct told me to run back to town, but thankfully, I chose not to make any sudden moves. I somehow knew we wouldn't get far if either of us ran. For what felt like an eternity, the creature watched us, seemingly deciding whether to drop its kill in exchange for us. Then it hunched over and made that terrible sound again before backing up and jumping over a 5-meter cliff behind it. It climbed further up the cliff and vanished from sight. It was massive with grayish-white fur and could stand on 2 legs when it needed to. Its jaws and claws looked powerful, but worst of all were its eyes. They seemed filled with nothing but hunger and malice. I can't say I enjoy nighttime hikes anymore. In the spring of last year, reports surfaced from sheep farmers along the Dutch-German border, particularly in the eastern Dutch provinces and in the southeast of the country. These shepherds reported multiple incidents of their sheep and even some sheepdogs being slaughtered but not eaten. These cases made headlines several times. If the culprits had been wolves, as many suspected, their behavior was odd. Wolves don't just kill their prey and leave it behind, nor do they typically fight sheepdogs, especially alone. Moreover, the territory was secured with dogs and electric fences. Yet, reports persisted of sheep and sheepdogs being killed, sometimes partially eaten. In the southeast, 11 sheep, 6 of them lambs, were found dead but untouched otherwise. No trace was found of the killer except for deep bite marks on the slaughtered sheep and 1 paw print measuring about 7 inches. After those killings, silence followed until new reports claimed wolves were responsible for the deaths. DNA tests supposedly confirmed this based on the bite marks. Roughly a year later, a small pack of wolves settled in the largest Dutch national park, Veluwe, and no more sheep killings were reported in the news. The killer of the 11 sheep in the southeast was also confirmed to be a wolf, but this wasn't backed by DNA results or further evidence. Some claimed young wolves seeking territory were responsible for attacking sheep on farms to assert dominance. However, this contradicted the belief that wolves wouldn't approach human settlements, especially those guarded by dogs and electric fences. The whole situation felt suspicious. I've always loved hiking in the woods at dusk, so much so that I've gone at least 3 times this year, despite it being illegal to visit the forest after sunset or before dawn. I often took short walks just before sunset and left when it was almost dark, wearing dark clothes to avoid being spotted by foresters or any creepy characters. I don't know why I'm so drawn to hikes, especially at night. I felt a strong pull to the wild since my first off-trail adventure in the summer of 2017. No matter the time of day, I always feel energetic and excited about heading into the woods. I even sometimes felt an urge to hunt when I spotted deer or rabbits, but I lacked both a license and weapons, so I knew I wouldn't be able to do that. A few weeks ago, at the start of autumn, I went for another night hike in the forest, bringing my flashlight since it was cloudy and rainy as usual. I rode my mountain bike there and chained it to a pole before heading into the darkness between the trees. I saw the last visitors walking back to their cars as I went in the opposite direction. By the time I reached the middle of the forest, it was completely dark. I enjoyed the cold, the scents, and the sounds of the woods, nearly forgetting about my encounter in these same woods almost 2 years earlier. After sitting down on a wooden bench nearby, I heard the faint bleating of sheep about 200 meters away. I stood up and started walking toward the noise, which sounded distressed, as if the sheep were panicking and trying to escape. I was surprised I could hear it from that distance, but even more surprised when I smelled the sheep. The wind was blowing in my direction, but I didn't know I had that ability. I should note that encountering a flock of sheep in these woods is quite normal since local shepherds use different areas to control weed growth. One day you might find them on the moor, and another day near the lake. A low, removable electric fence keeps the sheep from wandering off. That night, the flock had been placed on a small moor about 200 meters from where I sat on the bench. It took a while to get to the pen, as the flock was hidden by bushes. When I arrived, I was shocked to find not only were the sheep running around in panic, but 2 were lying in a pool of blood. Their throats had been torn open by jaws that looked bigger than a dog or wolf's. Strangely, There were no signs of the fence being disturbed, but I noticed enormous canine paw prints around the sheep's bodies and the pen, as if the killer had cautiously walked around, choosing its prey before moving in for the attack. While the sight was horrifying, I wasn't as terrified as I thought I would be. Instead, I felt frustrated that something was causing havoc in my woods. I had begun to view these woods as a second home. As reckless as it was, I decided to follow the tracks, curious to see who or what was roaming the forest at night. If I had known better, I would have realized I might be walking into danger. I followed the massive tracks until the dense trees made it hard to see. I changed my mind, realizing I couldn't see much in this light. I turned on my flashlight, still hearing the sheep panicking in the distance, just about 55 meters behind me. Then, I felt uneasy when a new scent reached me, a mix of wet dog and fresh blood. This was soon accompanied by calm footsteps approaching me, as if something was coming to check me out. I aimed my flashlight toward the source of the scent and sound and saw eyes. Golden yellow eyes about 4 feet off the ground. This meant whatever it was bigger than a dog and a wolf. I froze as the creature stepped closer. I could now make out its face and body. It resembled a wolf but was slightly larger and sturdier. Its fur was dark on its back and lighter on its belly, with a short dark mane on its neck. The animal seemed to be observing me cautiously but didn't appear aggressive. However, from the blood on its snout, I realized it must be the one that killed the sheep, and I felt genuine fear. Any sudden movements could mean my death. I had no chance against a creature this size. Still, the creature came closer, stopping about 5 meters away from me. As I stood there in awe and silence, the creature stood up on 2 legs like a bear, towering over me at about 7 feet tall. I felt chills run down my spine and took a more defensive stance. I reminded myself not to show fear. I've been hiking in the Ozarks for many years. I'm a 34-year-old man somewhat obsessed with staying fit and healthy. This interest began as an insecurity during my high school years. As an overweight teenager, I felt motivated to change my lifestyle, so I started hiking and camping with my father. Within a year, I had shed the excess weight, but I found I couldn't get enough of the great outdoors. The thrill I get from hiking is unmatched. A month after I turned 24, my father lost his battle with cancer. That's when hiking transitioned from a hobby I loved into a way of life. It was a passion that had brought us closer. But I'm not here to share my life story. I'm here to tell you something is very wrong with the deer in the Ozarks as of September 2021. The Ozarks are known as prime hunting territory, so the deer here are easily startled. They usually flee before you catch sight or scent of them. Lately, however, I've been stumbling upon them by chance, and it has been very strange. This incident occurred during a solo camping trip on September 5th. I packed up my camp early that morning and hit the hiking trail. Less than half an hour later, I was nearly paralyzed with fear when I suddenly spotted a large buck where the path had been clear before. It was grunting and snorting, pawing the dirt. I thought it hadn't seen me, so I shouted to scare it off, but strangely, the buck froze in place. It wouldn't look my way, no matter how loud I shouted. The buck was massive, with impressive antlers, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out to touch it. Definitely not my smartest move. To my astonishment, the buck did not move as I placed my palm on its side. My hand was resting just beneath its ribs, and at first, I was thrilled to touch a wild deer so closely. But that excitement quickly faded when I felt something moving beneath its skin. There was something wriggling inside the deer, like snakes. It felt as if thick worms or something similar were slithering around in there. I briefly thought the poor animal might have worms, but I quickly realized I had never seen worms that big. Maybe its organs were shifting around, I wondered, but that didn't make sense either. The only thing that seemed plausible was that its intestines were moving, but how and why? Then it struck me. Could this be a symptom of chronic wasting disease or some other illness? I jerked my hand away, regretting my foolishness. Touching an animal that acted so strangely could be dangerous. I scolded myself for being so reckless. I scrambled to grab my hand sanitizer and scrubbed my hand vigorously. When I looked up after a few moments, I was horrified to see the buck's face inches from mine, its mouth agape, emitting a low, grumbling sound from deep in its throat. The creature's breath smelled of decay, and inside its mouth were tumor-like growths, with dark gray, almost black flesh on top. I noticed that the rest of the buck's body hadn't moved. Instead, its neck had twisted unnaturally to bring its face close to mine. I stumbled backward, scrambling to my feet, but the deer did not follow. Holding my breath, I ran past it, glancing back as I hurried up the trail, but it remained still, not moving at all. For the next few hours, I walked, passing what should have been my second campsite for the weekend hike, and pressed on toward the third and final site. Despite my exhaustion, the image of that deer and the sensation of whatever was moving in its belly haunted me. I wanted to distance myself from that creature before settling down for the night. It took me several hours to reach the third site, and my legs ached even after taking several short breaks. Luckily, the rest of the evening was calm. I munched on some Cliff Bars, drank a bit too much water, and watched the sunset. About half an hour after it disappeared, I crawled into my tent and collapsed into my sleeping bag. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps approaching. Even over the chorus of crickets and rustling leaves, I could hear slow, heavy, yet graceful steps on the ground. The embers of my fire were still glowing, and I soon saw a faint shadow moving on the tent walls as the nighttime visitor walked between my tent and the fire. It was a deer, this time a doe. I watched her silhouette as she moved further into my campsite, closer to my tent. Her gait struck me as strange right away. She didn't seem cautious at all. Instead, she moved deliberately, placing her hooves ahead of herself and committing her full weight to each step. Her head didn't dart to the side, and her ears didn't flicker to check her surroundings. She seemed almost robotic, moving on autopilot until she came to a halt, all four hooves planted firmly on the ground. I stared at her for several minutes, expecting her to continue on, but she didn't budge. Just before I shouted at her to leave, I noticed her head turn. From my angle, I couldn't tell if she was looking at me or away from me, but something deep inside me knew the answer. My heart sank when I heard that deep, grumbling noise again, the same sound I'd heard when the buck had opened its mouth. This time it was louder. Was this doe also infected with whatever illness or parasite was plaguing the other deer? Maybe she was further along in her sickness. Suddenly, a sickeningly heavy sound hit the ground beneath her. I lay there in shock. No way did I just hear that. What had she just expelled? It sounded like an organ dropping to the ground. Distracted by the bizarre sight, I was caught off guard when I felt something slither under my right arm. I jumped up, cursing as I glanced down at the tent floor. There was indeed a large, worm-like bulge where my arm had been. Whatever it was, it squirmed beneath the tent fabric until it slipped out the other side and disappeared into the darkness. Thank goodness it had been outside, blocked by my tent. I'm no fool. I'm sure you can guess what I was thinking. Those wriggling things inside the deer had come right out of her mouth and crawled toward me. I stayed up all night with that doe just outside my tent, standing like a rotting statue, a 34-year-old man paralyzed by fear of a sick deer and whatever slimy, worm-like parasite had infected it. Eventually, sleep overtook me. I awoke in a sitting position in the corner of my tent as the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap. Outside, lying on the ground, was the doe. She was dead. I threw on my shoes and cautiously stepped outside for a better look. Her body was stiff, her legs straight, her eyes missing, and her belly looked impossibly thin and hollow, as if her insides had been removed. Strangely, there were no fluids on the ground. The doe had become a dry, flattened shell of a corpse. I hurriedly packed my things and left, placing my tent in a separate trash bag I had brought, planning to burn it when I returned home since that slithering thing had touched it. The hike out was safe and straightforward. I wasn't as sore as I had expected after my long hike the day before. My truck started without issue, and no strange parasites or infected deer attacked me. I simply drove home. When I got back, I called my mom to share this wild story. I struggled to force a laugh to help me deal with the experience. I haven't returned to the Ozarks since. Now I stick to other hiking trails, even if it means longer drives. It's worth it to stay safe. Lord knows what's happening with the deer in the Ozarks. The New England region of the United States has a fascinating past. Though not widely discussed, the locals are aware that the woods can sometimes feel uninviting. If anyone has advice about what I'm about to share, I'd really appreciate it. This occurred around a decade ago on a sunny afternoon when I was taking my dog for a walk on a quiet road close to my home, a path we had traveled countless times. Suddenly, I heard a strange bird call coming from just a little way into the trees. As I walked along, I kept hearing the bird again and again, just out of view. This annoyed me because I had never encountered that kind of bird before, and I was eager to see it for myself to figure out what it was. No matter how hard I searched the trees or the brush, I couldn't spot any movement, even as the bird's calls seemed to shift locations. When I reached a small bridge over a stream, I turned around to head back home. There were no actual houses along this part of the road, just the remnants of a mill from 200 years ago and a dilapidated house so old it still had an outhouse. The bird's call continued, coming at me with an almost maddening regularity. Eventually, my frustration peaked, and I stepped off the road to find the source of the sound. Every time I moved a few feet further in, the noise seemed to retreat deeper into the woods. How was this bird able to evade me so easily? Suddenly, everything around me snapped back into focus. It felt like I had awakened from a trance. I was now about 30 feet into the woods, and an eerie silence enveloped me. Why was I doing this? The only sound was that strange bird call. How could a bird shift about 15 feet in mere seconds without revealing itself? My determination to see this bird was quickly replaced by a sense of unsettling fear, and I felt foolish for even trying. I turned to casually walk back to the road and continued home. Those bird calls trailed behind me until I was well away from that old site. I attempted to walk my dog along that road several more times, but each time I heard those calls, a sensation of dread washed over me. Sounds odd, but it felt as if something was mocking me. My dog never showed any signs of distress, so perhaps it was all in my imagination. It's been long enough that while I can't quite remember how the bird sounded, I'm sure I'd recognize it instantly. I spent hours on YouTube listening to various bird calls, but never found the one I was looking for. I used to work at summer vacation resorts a few years back, and I made it a point to hike, camp, and explore the wilderness whenever I could. I worked for the resort at Lake Powell, which is surrounded by many unexplored canyons and ancient ruins. One late afternoon, after discovering several new beaches and large water holes, I was driving back to the dorms provided for seasonal workers without campers. It's important to note that Lake Powell is in a desert area, meaning the landscape is expansive with low brush all around. Some sections are used for cattle grazing, and you can always spot where the cowboys are moving them. You can even see the cowboys riding their horses. While on my way back to the dorms, I glanced to my right into the brushland and noticed some lights that looked like campfires. However, during this time of year, campfires aren't allowed. I pulled over, intrigued, because the roads are deserted at night and there are no streetlights for miles. I turned off the engine and focused on the lights. I've always enjoyed the tales told by Native Americans about desert creatures, so I felt no fear as I observed the lights. I thought they were merely campfires. As I continued watching, I began to think I was seeing people, but then the lights moved. I crossed to the other side of the road to get a better look. I realized there were no sounds of voices or laughter, the usual background noise of a campsite. This only fueled my curiosity, but I was careful not to step into the desert. I noticed that the lights floated more than 4 feet off the ground. My thoughts turned to the ghost light legends. My inner voice warned me not to follow them, but before I knew it, my body began to move against my will. Soon my shoes were filled with sand and brush as I trekked toward the lights. It felt as though I wasn't in control, yet I was fully awake. The lights came closer but somehow noticed me and moved further into the desert. When I reached the spot where I had seen them, I felt a warm, calming presence and noticed a lot of rubble around a clear area in the desert, as if a house once stood there. As I stepped into the center of the clear space, my movement halted and the lights vanished. The instant they went out, the air around me turned cold and the wind picked up. The chill was different from the usual coldness of the desert at night. It felt like I was being watched, almost as if I was intruding on someone's private space. I scanned the area and spotted a small path leading away, thinking that would be my best escape route. Before leaving, I glanced back, feeling as if someone was approaching me, and I saw the lights returning slowly, as if waiting for me to depart. I apologized for trespassing and promised I wouldn't return unless they wanted me to. The lights flickered back on, almost like a flash but slower. I didn't feel welcome, so I took the path back to my car. As soon as I got in, I heard a slap against my window, almost like something was saying, "Wait." I turned back to the spot where the lights had been, and it looked like there were people gathered around a campfire. I knew there hadn't been anyone in that area when I left. This time, I didn't feel unwelcome, just a sense of wanting to be left in peace. I said a small prayer and drove away. The next day, I invited a few friends to return to that spot with me. All we discovered were the remains of an old building and some pottery. I felt that same sense of not wanting to disturb the land, so we decided to leave. As we began to walk away, the wind picked up again, and I could have sworn I heard someone whisper "thank you" on the breeze. I've experienced many intriguing moments while at Lake Powell over the years, many of which involved stories from the Native Americans. I never dared to ask questions, though, for fear of becoming a tale myself. My dad and I, let's call him Charlie for this story, were supposed to meet my nephew Liam and my brother to go camping and hiking for the weekend along a section of the Appalachian Trail just outside Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The drive there would take us nearly 8 hours, so Charlie and I decided to leave around 7 to ensure we arrived with enough daylight to hike a good distance down the trail. For the record, when it comes to punctuality, my dad is not the most dependable person. He's a great guy, but always seems to have some excuse for being late. He tries to make a joke out of it, but he gets defensive if you don't laugh at his excuses. I can't recall what his excuse was this time when he pulled into my apartment complex at almost 10 a.m., honking his horn multiple times, as if I was the one who delayed us. I was furious. Nothing annoys me more than someone honking their horn like crazy instead of just walking up to the door to knock. The entire drive to meet Liam and my brother, I barely spoke to him. I was so mad, but he kept trying to be silly, hoping to ease my frustration for his tardiness without even calling beforehand. We stopped at a few rest areas for snacks, and whenever we got back in the car, he would light up a cigarette, which he knew I hated. But Charlie does what he wants, no matter what others think. Around noon, when we were supposed to meet up with Liam and my brother, they began texting me. I told them my dad was running late and we'd probably arrive around 6. They were annoyed as well. The sky started to turn orange as we finally pulled into the parking lot where we'd leave our cars. This section of the trail had an optional loop we planned to take to return to the cars after the trip. As soon as we stopped and got out, it started to rain. A cold, misty kind of rain that was annoying since we should have already reached the camping area. Liam and my brother were teasing Charlie so much that he took even longer to gather his gear. By the time we finally started hiking, we had to use the headlamps we packed just to see anything under the trees. For those who don't know, flashlights and headlamps aren't very effective in the complete darkness of a forest. They might increase your visibility from right in front of you to about 20 feet, if that. With the rain pouring down about an hour into the hike, we could barely see 5 to 10 feet in front of us. We were all miserable, and to keep our spirits up and maybe scare off any bears, my brother suggested we start singing. We began belting out old songs. I can't remember what they were, but we definitely weren't singers, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. At one point, Liam tripped while crossing a creek in the dark and smashed a watch he had gotten at a company retreat. That thing was destroyed. At that point, we were just looking for a place to set up our hammocks for the night so we could get some sleep. However, since we had all our food with us, we needed to reach one of the designated spots on the trail that had ropes to hang our gear out of the bear's reach. So we had to keep moving. Finally, in almost complete darkness and what had turned into a light drizzle again, we arrived. I had lost track of time but figured it was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m. We pulled out our hammocks and rain covers from our packs and hung the packs on the ropes. If that isn't the correct term for those ropes, that says something about my hiking experience. This was the first time any of us, except Liam, had done something like this. We set up on a small hill where several trees allowed us to tie our hammocks in a straight line. They were a good distance off the trail and in a small clearing, too. If you've never set up a hammock for sleeping on a hill, let me tell you, it's not ideal, but it was all we had that night. After we got settled in, we said goodnight and crawled into our tents. I dozed off for a bit before waking abruptly with an unsettling feeling of being watched. I tried not to dwell on it, as I tend to be a little paranoid, so I figured it was just my nerves in a new environment. No one else was awake, and the usual animal sounds filled the air, so I thought everything was fine and tried to drift back to sleep. Just as I closed my eyes, I heard a strange female voice whisper in my ear, "Come with me." The voice sounded eerie, almost ghostly, and it called my name. It was as if someone leaned in really close to share a secret, but I felt no breath. I quickly turned on my headlamp, which I had worn to sleep, and looked around. There was nothing and no one in sight, and I no longer heard the forest noises. I stayed in my hammock, not that I believed it offered any real protection, and I took out my knife, holding it across my chest while I waited. The voice came several more times, but each time there was nothing there. The voice seemed to come from nowhere, whispering directly into my ear. I didn't hear any footsteps on the autumn leaves or anything rustling in the trees or bushes, just that voice calling my name, urging me to come join it. Every time I heard it, the hair on my body stood on end, and I was wide awake, unable to sleep again until the forest sounds returned. I know strange things exist in the world, and the only thing I could think it might have been was a fey creature or some kind of being. My family, however, are all complete skeptics when it comes to anything paranormal that isn't mentioned in the Bible. Once we packed up and started walking, I had my brother lag behind for a moment, and I asked him if he had heard anything odd last night. He looked pale but didn't say a word. The worst part was that we still had 2 more nights out there. Fortunately, the next day we got an earlier start again, thanks again to my dad. We found a spot where we could arrange our hammocks in a circle that night, and luckily, the voice didn't return, nor did it the next night. We just had a tough hike ahead of us to get back to the cars. This was one of the strangest, and as long as I have anything to say about it, only overnight hiking experiences of my life. My partner and I began living in our camper van last October, starting our journey with a visit to family in West Texas before heading to Arizona for a music festival. After the festival, we decided to linger in Tucson for a bit, enjoying the gym and mineral show, before traveling north to Flagstaff and then on to the Grand Canyon. While en route to the Grand Canyon, we stumbled upon a fantastic boondocking spot in the Coconino National Forest. It was on a narrow Forest Service road with just 2 spots, one of which was occupied by a man and his young son, who I guessed were spending the day in Sedona, about 45 minutes away, and then retiring to their RV. We were lucky to get the last spot before crossing, which was amazing. It sat on a hill that had been leveled at the top, offering views of all the surrounding mountain ranges, with a ranch fence beside us. The ranch was in the next valley over, and wild cattle roamed around, making the scenery absolutely stunning. I spent most of the day just gazing at it. The area was incredibly remote, which we appreciated because we loved stargazing and privacy. We usually went to bed early around sunset and woke up around sunrise with a bathroom break in the middle of the night. One night, we woke up and went outside for a bathroom break, and we couldn't believe how bright the stars looked. We went back to bed and decided to stay another night just to see the stars again. The next day, we listened to music and relaxed, taking in the view. I kept noticing a bright light shining on a particular ridge and mentioned it to my partner. But when he looked, it was gone. It wasn't something I considered too seriously until I saw it a few more times and began to worry. As a wilderness first responder, I thought there might be a hiker stranded on the ridge trying to get our attention. However, the light's position changed too frequently for someone to be walking or biking. Later that evening, after dinner, we sat outside to watch the sunset and then retreated into the van as it got darker, waiting for the stars and the Milky Way to appear. Around 10 or 11 p.m., we stepped outside again, and I immediately looked up. A brilliant white light appeared that seemed to be close. I asked if it could be the North Star and how it could be so bright and near. My partner wasn't sure, so we walked around the van, scanning the sky for satellites. After circling back to our original spot, we noticed the light had vanished. But then we saw it again, moving away rapidly, now a different color. It darted around like a hummingbird, changing between yellow, red, and blue. Having witnessed various phenomena in my life, I didn't feel particularly alarmed, especially since we had just seen the Marfa lights, which looked similar but moved more fluidly. That all changed moments later when the light morphed into deep violet and blue hues with shades of magenta. It was almost tranquil and soothing as it approached us, its colors shifting to blues, violets, pinks, and greens. It came down to ground level on the other side of a large juniper tree. I lost my breath, as the tree was just a short distance from us. At that moment, we saw the light peeking at us from behind the juniper, just as we had been peeking at it from around our van. It moved curiously, almost like a child, and I imagined the light was where its face would be, standing as tall as an average man. Suddenly, I realized how close we were to seeing it, and fear gripped me because I wasn't sure I was ready to encounter whatever it was. It felt like a big secret about to be revealed, and once it was known, there would be no turning back. I might have gasped or jumped back in fear, and this light did not like that. It sank low to the ground, almost crawling, and began to pulsate red, a color of aggression. To be honest, I was terrified, and we dashed back into the van, locking the doors behind us. Our van has Mylar bubble wrap insulation in the windows, which we put up in winter to keep in the heat, so we couldn't see outside. At that point, I didn't want to look anyway. I was too frightened to breathe normally. Once we calmed down, we felt the need to investigate. What person wouldn't? We stepped out to check the area where the light had been, but now it seemed empty. This was a relief, yet it also made me question if I had imagined the whole thing. Then, glancing to my left, just beyond the ranch fence, I spotted several of the same type of lights moving back and forth in greens and blues. They were far enough away that I felt a bit calmer about it. For some reason, I turned toward the ridge I had been watching earlier that day and thought I saw something larger shifting in the darkness. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but then a bright light illuminated the area. It wasn't just a light, it was a creature, similar to what you'd expect in movies depicting robotic aliens. This machine was large and clearly visible, shining a light into the valley where we had seen the blue and green lights moments before. It flashed a couple of times and then disappeared, taking all the other lights with it. I wished we had thought to grab our phones, but everything had happened so quickly that it didn't even cross our minds. There were strange things in the photos I had taken during our trip, though. This tale unfolded when my father shared it with me for the first time recently. He was searching for a tent he had borrowed a few years back and had to confess it had been burned during a drunken adventure by a local river. A whole different story by itself. So, back in 1976, when my dad was 16, he and my uncle Nigel were quite adventurous and loved to explore. That summer, after my dad finished school, he wanted to embark on one big adventure before starting work. They set their sights on the Pennine Way, which for those unfamiliar, is a 270-mile walking trail in England. It stretches from the southern parts of Scotland down to the Midlands and typically takes about 3 to 4 weeks to complete. With a long summer ahead, my dad, his 15-year-old Uncle Nigel, and a friend named Russ were dropped off in Scotland by my great-grandfather to begin their hike. The first week went perfectly. They met friendly locals who cooked meals for them and offered them a place to sleep, enjoying a newfound freedom. They usually camped in open areas, but one day they decided to cover an extra 5 miles to reach a village for more food and spare tent pegs. They arrived at the village around 6 p.m. and noticed the local pub was opening. After spending some time there enjoying drinks, my dad mentioned that the pub owner probably knew they were underage but welcomed them nonetheless. The owner even offered them a place to camp in the back field of the pub. The landlady, the owner's wife, seemed a bit unsure at first and whispered something to her husband privately, but her Yorkshire hospitality soon won out. After a night of heavy drinking with the locals, they headed to their tent. My dad recalled using an oil lantern hanging from the center of the tent for light. When they turned it off, they left it hanging there, which was crucial for what happened next and the day after. The next morning, my dad woke up and switched on the oil lamp, contemplating whether to head out into the field since the owners had been kind enough to let them camp. Then he heard a door creak open and shut. There were no footsteps, so he thought it might be an old shed door. However, after a moment, he heard footsteps on the grass getting closer until they stopped right outside the tent. My dad assumed it was just the owner checking on them. As he began to unzip the tent, the owner opened it fully. My dad noted that the man wasn't wearing a shirt, just slippers and pajama pants. When my dad asked what he was doing, the owner mumbled some excuse about hearing a noise and wanting to check if the boys were all right. After looking around, my dad noticed there had been no noise aside from the door and footsteps. The man insisted they should get a good night's rest before their hike and oddly tapped the oil lamp, requesting it be turned off. He then walked away with a frustrated sigh, shutting the door behind him. In the morning, the owner's wife prepared breakfast for the boys while they packed their things. The owner took down the tent for them and drove off in his 4x4 without returning to the house. They thanked the woman and asked her to thank her husband, to which she replied she would once he returned, as he had left early that morning. They reached their planned camping spot beside a small stream about an hour and a half early and decided to take a longer break after covering roughly 130 to 140 miles in the past 8 to 9 days. They set up their tent only to find numerous small holes, about the size of a pen, all over it, which my dad noted while holding a pen. Everyone was puzzled, and my dad guessed that the owner's mention of an animal the night before might explain it. Perhaps it had come back and nibbled on their tent. Russ suggested they walk back to the village 2 miles away to try and find another tent. They left their damaged tent as a marker and headed back to the village. Luckily, a shop catering to hikers was open, but they had no tents. Instead, they bought some tape to cover the holes for the night, hoping to find a new tent soon. As they walked back, the sun began to set, and it grew dark, with only the moonlight guiding them. When they arrived at their campsite, they were shocked to find their tent set up but engulfed in flames. They quickly poured water from their bottles onto the tent and filled them from the stream to put out the fire. Inside the tent, they discovered that the glass of their oil lamp had been shattered. Someone had followed them, set up their tent, and waited for their return before breaking the oil lamp, igniting the tent in flames. My dad told me there was really no explanation for it, except possibly the pub owner. He might have been thwarted in whatever he was plotting when my dad woke up, leading him to take some twisted form of revenge. At first, I didn't believe my dad and thought he was trying to frighten me. But when I called Uncle Nigel about the burning tent incident, he immediately began talking about how strange it all was. My Uncle Nigel never lies. A few years back, in April 2010, if I remember right, I had just finished winter quarter at my first college and was enjoying spring break. I, along with 3 friends, decided to take advantage of the first nice day of the year by heading outdoors. I live in Western Washington, where there's a road that runs along Bellingham Bay and Samish Bay, north of Puget Sound. It's called Chuckanut Drive, a scenic route that winds along a cliff and overlooks the water. Along the way, there are several turnouts perfect for taking pictures and other sightseeing. My friends and I drove up and parked at one of those spots with plans to hike down to the water, have some lunch and beers, and enjoy the day. The trail we picked ended near a set of train tracks that ran along the coast, much like the highway above. This detail is important because many homeless individuals and other interesting characters often traveled that area. We sat on some driftwood on the opposite side of the tracks by the bay, watching various people pass by while we relaxed. No one bothered us, and we didn't bother them, though about half of the folks we saw were bundled up, with blankets and tarps draped over them. We were there for about an hour before realizing it was more boring than we'd expected, so we decided to find something else to do. As we were leaving, we noticed what looked like a much better path back up than the one we'd come down. We chose this new route, and that's when things took a strange turn. Not long after we started hiking up, we all spotted what appeared to be a blanket wrapped around something else. It was clear that it was covering something large, but not quite the size of a full-grown person. Instantly, we knew it was a body. To this day, I remember silently repeating to myself, "Don't be a kid. Don't be a kid. Don't be a kid." As we approached, we were relieved to see it wasn't a dead child. But sadly, it was a dead dog. The head was missing, and the body had been cut cleanly off just above the collar, which it was still wearing. There was no blood, and the blanket looked as if it had just come out of the linen closet moments before. There was also no smell from the body, so it hadn't been there long. Furthermore, branches and bushes had been disturbed and arranged to try to conceal the body from view, with the tracks only about 10 to 15 feet away from where we stood. It was clearly a body dump. Someone had murdered this poor dog and discarded it by the railroad tracks, likely very recently. We exchanged worried glances and decided to leave immediately, scrambling up the steep trail back to the road. We reached my friend's SUV and sped off as fast as we could. Later, we called the local sheriff's office about what we'd found, but they seemed to assume a stray dog had been hit by a train when we mentioned that its head was missing. We never heard back from them, so I can only guess they either didn't find it or didn't bother to look. Regardless, I haven't returned to that stretch of road since. It kept following us from Stan M. Music. This took place during my quarantine last year. I've actually encountered a cryptid or some strange creature before. It was June when this incident occurred, and school had just let out. I was 17 at the time. In late May and early June, we finished all our assignments, and if you had nothing left to do, you didn't need to go to school. We all enjoyed fishing, which was pretty much the only activity we could do. Every morning at around 6 a.m., 6 of my friends and I would wake up. One of us would pick the others up since we all lived nearby. We would head to a large pond to fish for trout and bass. It was fantastic, especially with a bait shop just 2 minutes away. On the last day of school, we decided to try a new location. We all used an app called Fishbrain to find different spots nearby. We discovered a place that was reputed to have plenty of trout. There were also some areas that looked promising for rainbow and brook trout, and occasionally brown trout. It was a half-hour drive, and we all agreed to go there. My friend Lincoln drove us, and we set off for the 30-minute journey. After arriving, we hiked a 4-mile trail to reach the fishing spots. We got there around 6:30, unpacked, and headed up the trail. I preferred fly fishing, so I brought my fly rod for small trout in shallow areas and my regular rod for deeper spots where larger trout might be lurking. After about 10 minutes of hiking, we reached our first spot. It was barely large enough for 3 people, so we split into groups. My friends Mac and Devin and I went one way while Harry, Lincoln, and Connor went another. We agreed to meet back at the trailhead at noon. My group stayed at a spot with a few rainbow trout swimming in the creek, perfect for fly fishing. My friend ventured out a bit where there was a hole with a large trout and some sunnies. I was getting bites on the surface but couldn't catch anything. After about 20 minutes, I heard something nearby. Mac and Devin were joking around, trying to catch the rainbow trout, and I initially thought it was just a deer. But as the noise grew louder, they stopped talking. It didn't sound like a deer at all. It resembled more of a bear. We decided to move on to another spot, and after walking for about 5 or 10 minutes, Mac heard someone talking. We all froze and listened. Someone or something was softly speaking. Soon it became louder, and I heard what sounded like my friend Harry's voice saying, "Guys, come here." Lincoln hurt himself. We knew right away that wasn't Harry. It sounded too off, too raspy and fake. We called Harry's phone to check on him. He answered, and what he said sent chills down my spine. "We're at a little hole 20 minutes from where you are. We caught a smallmouth. What about you?" I hung up and glanced back toward where we had heard the voice. Suddenly, we heard a low, raspy growl that made me think of a scene from South Park where Randy Marsh says, "I'm so startled." We texted Harry, letting him know we were heading his way and told him not to move. We kept walking, and about 5 minutes later, we heard the voice again. This time it was supposed to be Connor's voice, saying, "Guys, Harry twisted his ankle, and he needs help." We knew that wasn't Connor either, so we pressed on. When we finally met up with the other group, we shared what had happened. We quickly left the mountain and drove home, discussing what it might have been, but we couldn't come to any conclusion. If anyone has any ideas, I'd love to hear them. A couple of years ago, I went hiking alone on various trails in the Blue Ridge Parkway. For some reason, I thought it was fine for a woman in her 20s to go by herself. Foolish, I know. I had always wanted to visit Mount Mitchell, so I decided to hike there. It wasn't a Monday, so there weren't many visitors. The path to the summit is paved, making it a relatively easy walk, though it is quite steep. I was a smoker at the time, so I was pretty out of breath. When I finally reached the top, I stepped to the side to catch my breath. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a man approaching me. He looked to be in his late 40s with greasy dark brown hair. He said, "Hey, I noticed it took you a while to get up here, and you're breathing pretty hard. Are you all right?" I was a bit surprised but replied that I was fine, joking about being a smoker to lighten the mood. He continued to stare at me, so I gave a small nod. signaling that I was going to move on. I walked over to a podium that indicated the direction of various mountains and cities in the distance, and he followed me. Out of nowhere, he began talking about how he had recently gone through a divorce and was part of a men's group that traveled around to famous tourist spots. I told him where I was from, and he started sharing very personal details about his divorce. He mentioned that he suspected his wife was cheating on him, so he hid in a closet one night and caught her in bed with a coworker. He complained that the booth paid dearly for that night. I tried to show that I was uncomfortable, but he kept talking and asking me questions without giving me a chance to respond. I concluded he was just lonely and wanted someone to talk to. Then I realized that he was alone the entire time, and I hadn't seen any men's group. Maybe they had split up for a bit. Regardless, I started to feel more anxious, so I told him I was heading back to the gift shop. He began to follow me again. There were many trails branching off from the main path to the summit, but I wasn't interested in any of those since I was still out of breath. Although I wasn't walking with him anymore, he called out loudly, "Hey!" I turned around, and he had a wide grin on his face, his hair somehow looking even greasier. He said, "Why don't we walk one of these trails? I could show you a really good time." I firmly replied, "No, thank you." To my left, I noticed two elderly women sitting on a bench. They had been watching us. One of the women called to the man, "I think it's time the young lady gets going now." I smiled softly at her and nodded. I turned around and walked briskly down the path, passing the gift shop and heading straight to my car. He hadn't followed me. That was my last hike of the day, and I was relieved that nothing worse happened while I was alone. I definitely don't go on outings like that by myself anymore.